We begin with perhaps the most ancient of circular questions, one that has circled back through millennia of human contemplation without ever truly finding solid ground. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? To understand this paradox in its fullest form, we must first acknowledge what we are actually observing in the natural world. Eggs existed long before chickens did, laid by fish and amphibians hundreds of millions of years before birds even evolved. Yet we persist in linking this particular question to a chicken and an egg as though they emerged simultaneously from nothingness. The real-life situation that generates this paradox is the simple fact of biological reproduction through ovulation, where organisms produce eggs that develop into offspring, which then produce more eggs, creating an unbroken chain that extends backward through deep time. When we ask which came first, we are essentially asking the question in a way that presupposes both entities must have originated at the same moment, or that one must have preceded the other in a logical sequence that defies the very nature of evolutionary development. The psychological mechanism behind this paradox's persistence lies in our human tendency to seek origins and clear beginnings, to draw sharp lines between before and after, to demand a first cause when the actual process involves gradual transformation over countless generations. Each chicken egg contains slightly different genetic material from the one that laid it, meaning at what precise moment did a proto-chicken become a chicken, and at what precise moment did its egg become a chicken egg. These boundaries simply do not exist in nature with the clarity our minds desperately seek. What makes this paradox particularly resilient despite its logical resolution through evolutionary biology is our tendency to frame it as a genuine mystery rather than an artifact of how we ask questions. We have normalized the paradox by treating it as a philosophical koan rather than acknowledging that asking which came first assumes a framework of discrete moments and creatures that nature does not operate within. Imagine a soldier who desperately wants to be grounded from flying dangerous combat missions, which is entirely reasonable given the constant threat of death. Yet to request this grounding requires him to file a formal report declaring himself mentally unfit for duty, and once he files such a report, the military authorities examine his psychological state and determine that anyone rational enough to recognize the danger and request removal from it is obviously sane enough to continue flying, thereby denying his request and forcing him back into the sky, while conversely, if he never files the report and continues flying without complaint, he demonstrates the kind of mental stability that keeps him in the rotation indefinitely. This is the essence of Catch-22, a self-perpetuating logical trap where the very act of solving the problem proves you do not have the problem and therefore you cannot solve it. The mechanism operates on a fundamental paradox of human systems. The criteria for escaping a harmful situation are intentionally constructed such that only those already harmed by the situation can meet them, yet the moment they meet them, they are deemed unworthy of escape. It is a closed loop with no exit because the gatekeeper controls both the lock and the definition of who qualifies for freedom. We encounter these traps everywhere in modern life, in bureaucracies that require proof of income to qualify for assistance, yet you cannot earn income while destitute, in healthcare systems that deny treatments unless you can afford them while charging prices that ensure you cannot afford them, in employment where you need experience to get the job but cannot gain experience without the job. What makes Catch-22 particularly insidious is that it persists not through malice but through institutional inertia, through systems that have calcified around their own contradictions and now operate with such normalcy that we barely perceive them as problems anymore, accepting them as simply how things must be, when in reality they are monuments to human illogic that we have collectively agreed to pretend make perfect sense. Consider the architect who strips away every ornamental detail from a building, leaving only bare walls and essential structure, and somehow the space feels more elegant, more valuable, more desirable than before. Consider the minimalist wardrobe where someone owns fewer clothes yet appears more stylish, more put together, more intentional with their presentation. Consider the writer who deletes half their manuscript and what remains is somehow stronger, more powerful, more moving than the original verbose version had ever been. In each of these scenarios, the removal of material actually increases the perception of quality, value, and impact, which seems to violate everything we might expect about accumulation and abundance. The paradox deepens when we examine its psychological mechanisms, because our brains are drawn to completion and fullness, to the sensation of plenty and saturation, yet we consistently experience greater satisfaction when we encounter restraint and limitation. This happens because subtraction forces intentionality. Every remaining element must justify its presence. Every word or object or detail serves a purpose, and this density of meaning actually overwhelms our aesthetic and emotional faculties more effectively than excess ever could. When we remove the superfluous, we remove distraction, we create space for contemplation, we force the viewer or reader or inhabitant to engage more actively rather than passively consuming abundance. The mechanism also involves something deeper about human psychology. We fear missing out, we fear scarcity, yet scarcity is precisely what creates perceived value, what makes us pay attention, what makes our engagement feel more precious. And despite understanding this paradox intellectually, despite seeing it operate across centuries of design and literature and philosophy, we still instinctively accumulate, we still fill spaces, we still add words and decorations and possessions as though more will somehow satisfy us more completely, even as evidence continuously demonstrates the opposite. Consider the wooden puppet whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie, a character so embedded in our cultural consciousness that we rarely pause to examine the logical trap he represents. Imagine Pinocchio standing before us and uttering a single sentence, "My nose will grow." In this moment, we encounter a paradox that mirrors the self-referential contradictions found in classical logic problems, yet one that remains deeply unsettling precisely because it involves the act of deception itself. If Pinocchio's statement is true, then his nose will grow as promised, which means he was telling the truth, and yet the magical mechanism should only activate when falsehoods emerge. If his statement is false, then his nose will not grow, which validates his prediction, making the statement true after all. We find ourselves trapped in an infinite loop where truth becomes falsehood and falsehood becomes truth in the same breath, a logical corridor with no exit. The paradox functions by weaponizing the very nature of self-reference against itself, creating a scenario where the causal mechanism that punishes dishonesty becomes paralyzed by its own rules. What makes this paradox particularly insidious is how it reveals the fragility of systems built on absolute accountability. Pinocchio's curse becomes useless the moment he gains awareness of its structure. We often accept magical punishment systems in stories without questioning their logical foundations, treating them as narrative devices rather than logical problems. Yet when examined closely, the Pinocchio Paradox demonstrates that any enforcement mechanism tied to truthfulness must eventually encounter statements that reference their own truth value, and in those moments, the entire framework collapses into paradox. This unresolved contradiction exists not in the real world, but in the space between fiction and logic, reminding us that even our most beloved moral tales contain hidden contradictions that defy resolution. And perhaps this is why the story endures so powerfully despite its logical impossibility. Imagine a small town where there exists a single barber, a man who cuts the hair of everyone in the town who does not cut their own hair, and crucially, he cuts the hair of no one who cuts their own hair. This seems like a perfectly reasonable arrangement at first, a simple division of labor where the barber has carved out his specific role within the community. But now consider this single, inescapable question: who cuts the barber's hair? If the barber cuts his own hair, then by definition he is someone who cuts his own hair, and therefore the barber does not cut his hair, which means he must have someone else cut it. But if someone else cuts his hair, then he is not cutting his own hair, so the barber must cut it, which contradicts the previous conclusion. This circular logic trap, formalized as a self-referential problem in set theory, reveals a fundamental fracture in how we construct rules and categories. The paradox exists because the barber's defining characteristic, that he cuts hair for those who do not cut their own, creates an impossible condition when applied to himself, the very person who established the rule. At its core, this demonstrates how systems that seem logically sound and internally consistent can collapse when they attempt to contain themselves within their own boundaries. The Barber Paradox persists in our consciousness not merely as an abstract logical puzzle, but as a revelation that language and rules, no matter how carefully constructed, can create traps for themselves when self-reference enters the equation. We have normalized this paradox by assuming that most real-world barbers simply cut their own hair or visit another barber, thereby avoiding the logical trap through practical exemption. Yet the fundamental problem remains: any rule that claims to categorize all members of a set while including the set itself as a potential member faces the risk of generating this exact contradiction. The paradox forces us to recognize that not all sets can contain themselves, and not all rules can be universally self-applicable without revision or exception-making. Imagine you have a sack containing 100 kilograms of potatoes, and you discover that these potatoes are 99% water by weight. You decide to leave them outside on a dry day, allowing the sun and wind to work their magic, reducing their water content until the potatoes become 98% water instead of 99%. Most people would assume that only a small amount of water has evaporated, perhaps a kilogram or two at most, but the mathematical reality is far more startling than our intuition suggests. When you perform the calculation, you find that 50 kilograms of potatoes have mysteriously vanished. The sack now weighs only 50 kilograms instead of 100, despite the fact that the water content has decreased by merely 1 percentage point. This counterintuitive outcome arises because we fail to properly account for how percentages scale relative to the total mass. When potatoes are 99% water, the remaining 1% represents the dry matter, which means 1 kilogram of that original 100 kilogram sack is solid potato and 99 kilograms is water. When the potatoes dry to 98% water, that 1 kilogram of dry matter still exists unchanged, but now it represents 2% of the total mass rather than 1%, forcing the total weight to collapse to 50 kilograms for the mathematics to remain consistent. The paradox reveals a fundamental gap between how our minds instinctively process proportional change and how the actual mathematics of percentages function, particularly when dealing with small increments that seem negligible but produce dramatic consequences when applied to composite systems. We encounter this thinking error repeatedly in our daily lives, whether we are interpreting statistics about pollution reduction, analyzing body composition changes, or evaluating financial portfolio adjustments. Yet we rarely notice that our intuitions have failed us until the numbers are laid bare before us. Imagine a composer in the year 2024 who has always dreamed of hearing Beethoven's 10th Symphony, a work that was never completed during the legendary composer's lifetime. One day, through means we won't examine too closely, this composer acquires a time machine, travels backward to the year 1827, and gives Beethoven the complete manuscript of the 10th Symphony. Beethoven, delighted and perhaps slightly bewildered, studies the work, refines it, and publishes it under his own name, ensuring its place in history. Our composer then travels forward again, back to 2024, where they discover that this symphony has always existed in historical records, always attributed to Beethoven, always studied in conservatories worldwide. The composer realizes with a creeping sense of existential vertigo that the symphony they traveled back in time to deliver was itself a copy of the original that Beethoven created, except Beethoven never created it independently. He only created it because the composer brought it to him. The information exists, the music is real, but its origin point has vanished entirely into a causal loop of impossible recursion. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our fundamental understanding of causality, information, and creation itself. At its heart lies a deceptively simple logical impossibility. Information or an object exists in a closed temporal loop with no external point of origin, creating an infinite regress where the cause of something is the thing itself, displaced in time. The mechanism functions through time travel paradoxes that contradict the law of conservation of information, which suggests that information cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Yet in the Bootstrap Paradox, information appears to come from nowhere, violating both logical causality and thermodynamic principles. Imagine you possess a time machine, a device that defies every constraint the universe has imposed upon us, and you decide to use it to travel backward through decades to meet your grandfather when he was young, before he ever met your grandmother. In this moment, standing before him in the past, you raise a weapon or simply push him from a cliff and he dies. He never meets your grandmother. Your parent is never born. You are never born. And yet here you stand in the past, breathing, thinking, experiencing this very moment as a conscious being. How can you exist to kill the man whose existence made your existence possible? This is the grandfather paradox, perhaps the most infamous logical puzzle in discussions of time travel, and it has haunted philosophers and physicists for nearly a century. The paradox works by creating a logical contradiction so fundamental that it seems to tear at the fabric of causality itself. If you kill your grandfather before your parents' conception, the chain of events that led to your birth becomes impossible, which means you could never have existed to travel back in time, which means your grandfather never dies, which means you are born, which means you can travel back, which means he does die. The mechanism behind this paradox is beautifully simple yet devastating in its implications. It exploits our intuitive understanding of cause and effect, the bedrock principle that events follow a linear sequence where earlier causes produce later effects. By introducing the possibility of changing the past, we introduce the possibility of undoing the very conditions that made our actions possible, creating a logical loop that can never be resolved. We cannot have both the freedom to change the past and a past that has already definitively occurred. Yet despite this apparent logical impossibility, despite the fact that the paradox seems to prove that time travel to the past should be fundamentally impossible, physicists and philosophers have continued to entertain the notion, proposing increasingly elaborate solutions. Imagine yourself standing in a grocery store aisle, facing a wall of cereal boxes stretching endlessly in both directions, each one promising a slightly different combination of taste, nutrition, texture, and value, and you realize that what should be a simple decision about breakfast has somehow become paralyzing, and you stand there for minutes comparing nutritional labels and prices and customer reviews on your phone, only to walk away feeling unsatisfied with whatever choice you eventually make. This scenario has become so commonplace in modern consumer culture that we rarely pause to consider how absurd it truly is, yet it represents one of the most persistent paradoxes of contemporary life. The idea that more options should make us happier, freer, and more satisfied, when in reality, an abundance of choices often produces the opposite effect. The psychological mechanism driving this paradox is rooted in the exponential increase of cognitive load that accompanies expanded choice sets, where each additional option requires mental energy to evaluate, compare, and consider against all alternatives, and simultaneously increases the likelihood that whatever option we select will feel suboptimal in hindsight, as we cannot help but imagine the roads not taken and wonder if another path might have served us better. Beyond this cognitive burden lies a deeper phenomenon known as the maximization trap, wherein people with access to infinite options often become obsessed with making the single best choice rather than simply finding something satisfactory, transforming a utilitarian decision into an exhausting quest for optimization that can never truly end. Imagine a donkey standing perfectly centered between two identical bales of hay, positioned at exactly equal distances on either side, with the animal experiencing equal hunger and equal motivation to eat from both piles. The medieval philosopher Jean Baradin proposed this thought experiment to illustrate a fundamental problem in rational decision-making, suggesting that without any rational basis to prefer one option over the other, the donkey would starve rather than make an arbitrary choice. The paradox seems almost whimsical in its construction, yet it points towards something profoundly troubling about how we understand motivation, reason, and action in the world. When we strip away all distinguishing characteristics between two options, when we eliminate any possible rational foundation for preference, the question becomes whether a rational creature can or should act at all, or whether the very concept of rationality itself begins to collapse under its own weight. The problem extends far beyond the imaginary suffering of a philosophical donkey, manifesting instead in the countless moments when human beings face genuinely equivalent choices with no clear rational advantage to either side. Moments when the decision-making apparatus that we trust to guide us through life seems to require something beyond pure reason to function. We encounter this paralysis in career decisions where two paths offer equal compensation and opportunity, in relationship choices where two people seem equally suitable, in consumer selections where products are virtually indistinguishable in quality and price, and in ideological commitments where competing worldviews present equally compelling arguments. Rather than starving like Baradin's unfortunate donkey, humans typically resolve this stalemate through recourse to what we might call arbitrary preference, coin flips, instinct, or simple habit. Yet we rarely acknowledge how often our lives are actually shaped by these fundamentally irrational selections that we then retroactively justify with rational arguments. Imagine a nation of individuals, each one deciding independently that they should save more money, spend less on consumer goods, and build up their personal reserves against uncertain times, which seems like the most rational and responsible decision any person could make. Each household cuts back on dining out, delays purchasing a new car, postpones home renovations, and reduces their overall consumption in pursuit of financial security and a more stable future. On the surface, this appears to be nothing but prudent behavior, the kind of discipline that financial advisors recommend and parents teach their children. Yet when this happens across an entire economy simultaneously, something unexpected and counterintuitive emerges that undermines the very goal everyone is trying to achieve. As individuals increase their savings and decrease their spending, the total amount of money flowing through the economy contracts. Businesses see their revenue decline because fewer customers are purchasing their products and services, and companies respond by laying off workers who suddenly find themselves unable to spend money at all. This creates a cascading effect where reduced consumer spending leads to business failures, unemployment rises, wages stagnate, and the collective wealth of the nation actually decreases despite everyone's best efforts to protect and grow their own wealth. The mechanism that causes this paradox lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of how individual rationality differs from collective outcomes, what economists call the fallacy of composition, where what is true for a single person becomes demonstrably false when applied universally. A single household can absolutely increase its financial security by saving more, but when millions of households do this simultaneously, they collectively destroy the economic engine that generates the income they are trying to save in the first place. Consider a society built upon the principle of tolerance, where citizens pride themselves on accepting diverse viewpoints, beliefs, and ways of living, yet this very commitment to tolerance creates an impossible logical trap that undermines itself from within. The paradox emerges when a tolerant society encounters intolerant ideologies and must decide whether to tolerate those who would, if given power, eliminate tolerance itself. If the society remains absolutely tolerant of all views, it risks enabling movements that actively seek to destroy tolerance and persecute those with minority beliefs, essentially using the tools of an open society to dismantle it. Conversely, if the society becomes intolerant of intolerance in order to protect itself, it abandons the foundational principle that defined it, becoming something other than what it claimed to be. This dilemma has haunted democratic nations throughout modern history as they grapple with extremist movements, authoritarian ideologies, and hate speech that exploit the very freedoms they were granted. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a deep conflict between our desire to be principled and consistent with our stated values and our instinct for self-preservation. We want to believe we are virtuous societies that embrace all perspectives, yet we simultaneously recognize that some ideologies pose genuine threats to vulnerable populations and to the democratic institutions themselves. This creates cognitive dissonance as we attempt to navigate impossible decisions about where to draw lines, who to deplatform, and which beliefs deserve protection. What makes this paradox so disorienting is that no perfectly logical solution exists, and yet modern societies have normalized a kind of awkward compromise where we apply tolerance inconsistently, drawing invisible boundaries that shift depending on political winds and collective anxiety. We police some speech while protecting others, sometimes based on principle and often based on fear or convenience, neither fully embracing nor fully rejecting the paradox itself. Consider the fundamental absurdity embedded within our economic and survival systems. Water, the substance without which human life ceases within days, costs nearly nothing in most developed nations, while diamonds, crystallized carbon that serves no biological function whatsoever, commands prices that can exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars per carat. A person can obtain enough water to sustain themselves for a month for the cost of a single cup of coffee, yet a modest diamond ring might require months or years of labor to acquire. This inversion of value based on actual human need represents one of the most normalized paradoxes of modern existence, so deeply woven into our cultural fabric that we rarely pause to examine its fundamental irrationality. The mechanism behind this contradiction lies in the intersection of scarcity, artificial constraint, and psychological conditioning. Water is abundant in most places where human civilization has flourished, making it plentiful and therefore economically cheap according to basic supply and demand principles. Diamonds, conversely, are genuinely rare, but more importantly, their rarity has been deliberately maintained and amplified through controlled mining and strategic market manipulation by a handful of powerful corporations that have spent over a century convincing humanity that these stones represent love, commitment, and status. We have been taught to desire what is scarce and to dismiss what is abundant, even when that abundant resource literally keeps us alive. The psychological layer runs even deeper. We assign emotional and symbolic weight to diamonds precisely because they are expensive and difficult to obtain, creating a feedback loop where the value itself becomes the point rather than any inherent utility or necessity. Picture a population that has built its culinary identity around butter, cream, cheese, and wine, foods laden with saturated fats and cholesterol that conventional nutritional wisdom has declared the enemy of cardiovascular health. Yet this same population experiences significantly lower rates of heart disease than nations that have embraced low-fat diets with religious fervor for decades. This is the French paradox, an observation that emerged in the 1980s when epidemiologists noticed that France, despite consuming roughly 3 times as much butter as Americans and eating cheese as a central component of nearly every meal, had heart disease mortality rates substantially lower than the United States and other countries obsessed with dietary restriction. The paradox deepens when you examine the details. The French enjoy rich pastries, fatty cuts of meat, full-fat dairy products, and regular wine consumption without the guilt or caloric counting that dominates Anglo-American food culture, yet their bodies seem to reward these indulgences with better health outcomes. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves several interconnected factors that challenge our assumptions about diet and disease. First, portion sizes in France remain modest by international standards, meaning that even foods high in fat are consumed in quantities that prevent excessive caloric intake, a reality often obscured when researchers compare French eating habits to American ones. Second, the French maintain a fundamentally different relationship with food itself, treating meals as social occasions to be savored slowly rather than transactions to be completed efficiently, which creates natural mechanisms for satiation and reduces the likelihood of overeating. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the stress associated with chronic dieting and food restriction may actually cause more metabolic harm than the foods being restricted, suggesting that the American approach to nutrition through deprivation and anxiety has created its own disease state independent of the foods consumed. Consider for a moment the peculiar observation that most of your friends probably have more friends than you do, a statistical reality that seems almost deliberately designed to undermine your sense of social adequacy. When researchers have examined social networks across universities, workplaces, and online platforms, they consistently discover that the average person's friends tend to have larger friend groups than the average person themselves, which creates an unsettling paradox where nearly everyone simultaneously feels as though their own social circle is smaller than their friends' circles. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in a mathematical principle known as the friendship paradox, which emerges naturally from the structure of networks themselves. People with many friends are more likely to appear in your friend list simply because they have more connections overall, so by pure probability, the friends you've selected are statistically more connected than a random person in the population would be. This creates a selection bias where you're essentially sampling from the most sociable members of your network rather than from a representative cross-section of society. Your friends aren't necessarily more popular than you in an absolute sense, but rather you've constructed a sample of your peers that skews toward those with larger networks, and this mathematical quirk persists because it's simply how networks organically structure themselves. What's remarkable is how this invisible distortion shapes human psychology despite being entirely explicable through probability, as people often internalize this observation as a personal failing rather than recognizing it as an inevitable feature of how social connection propagates through populations, leading countless individuals to feel quietly inadequate about their social lives while everyone around them experiences the identical illusion in parallel. Imagine you're in a room with 23 people and you want to know the odds that at least 2 of them share the same birthday. Your intuition immediately begins calculating. There are 365 days in a year, so surely the probability that any 2 people were born on the same day is vanishingly small, perhaps 1 in 300 or less. Yet when you actually run the mathematics, when you truly work through the combinatorial reality of the situation, you discover something that defies your gut feeling entirely. With just 23 people in that room, the probability that 2 of them share a birthday exceeds 50%, climbing to nearly 51% to be precise. Add just a few more people, and the odds become overwhelming, reaching 99% certainty with only 57 individuals present. This is the birthday paradox, and it persists as one of the most counterintuitive results in probability theory, one that continues to surprise mathematicians and laypeople alike despite having been understood for decades. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon reveals itself when you stop thinking about individual people and start thinking instead about pairs. With 23 people, you are not comparing each person to the calendar year. You are actually creating 253 possible pairs of people who might share a birthday. Each pair represents an independent opportunity for a match to occur. The more pairs you generate, the more chances you have for a collision, and this exponential growth in possible comparisons is what causes the probability to skyrocket far faster than intuition would suggest. Your mind, however, remains stubbornly attached to the wrong calculation, the one where you imagine a single person being compared against the full year, rather than imagining all those pairs simultaneously hunting for matches. Even after understanding the mathematics completely, even after accepting the proof without reservation, the paradox maintains its power over perception. Imagine the legendary ship of Theseus, the great hero of Athens, preserved for centuries as a monument to his memory and his voyages across ancient seas. The wooden planks that formed his hull, worn by salt water and time, begin to rot and splinter, and so the Athenians, in their devotion to maintaining this sacred vessel, replace the decayed timber with fresh wood, plank by plank, board by board, until eventually every single original component has been swapped out for new material. The question that emerges from this gradual restoration is deceptively simple yet philosophically devastating. Is this still the same ship? If we have replaced every physical atom that comprised the original vessel, at what point did it cease to be the ship of Theseus and become something entirely different? The paradox deepens further when we consider an alternative scenario. Suppose someone had collected all the original wooden planks as they were removed during the restoration process and then painstakingly reassembled them into a ship once more. Now we have two ships, and both could claim legitimacy to the title of the original. The first maintains continuous existence and function, never ceasing to be a ship for even a moment, while the second possesses the actual physical matter that once comprised the authentic vessel. Our intuitions pull in opposite directions, and neither answer feels entirely satisfying. What makes this paradox so persistently troubling is that we navigate similar questions constantly in our own existence without acknowledging the profound uncertainty underlying our conclusions. We consider ourselves the same person despite the fact that nearly every cell in our bodies has been replaced since childhood, that our memories fade and transform, that our personalities and beliefs shift across years and decades. We treat identity as a concrete property when it is perhaps merely a useful fiction we have constructed to organize our experience of continuity. Imagine a simple scenario that unfolds in countless ways throughout our daily lives. You have a pile of sand on a beach, and you begin removing grains one at a time. At what point does the pile cease to be a heap and become merely a collection of scattered grains? This is the ancient Allais Paradox, also known as the problem of the heap, and it has persisted in philosophical thought for over 2,000 years without resolution. When you remove the first grain, you still have a heap. Remove the second grain, and you still have a heap. No single grain's removal seems capable of transforming a heap into a non-heap, yet through this incremental process, you will eventually reach a point where only one grain remains, and surely that is not a heap at all. The paradox emerges from the apparent vagueness of the boundary between what constitutes a heap and what does not, and it extends far beyond beaches into every domain of language and categorization we employ. Consider hair loss. At what point does a person transition from having hair to being bald? 1 hair loss changes nothing. 10 hairs lost changes nothing, yet we all recognize baldness as a real condition, implying some threshold must exist, even though we cannot articulate precisely where that threshold lies. We encounter this same impossible boundary in our classification of colors. When does red become orange as we gradually shift the wavelength of light? When does someone transition from young to old, from warm to hot, from drunk to sober? The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about human language and cognition. We have developed categorical terms that presume sharp boundaries in what is actually a continuous spectrum, and we have done this because it serves us functionally in communication and navigation of the world. Our minds are pattern recognition machines that prefer discrete categories to infinite gradations, yet reality often refuses to cooperate with our linguistic preferences. Consider the man who has lost all the hair on his head, and notice how we treat this condition with a strange mixture of sympathy and social distance. as though baldness were simultaneously a medical misfortune and a personal failure. The bald man walks through the world carrying an involuntary visibility that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid, and yet we have constructed an elaborate system of meanings around his appearance that persists despite having no logical foundation whatsoever. When a man loses his hair, whether through aging, genetics, or illness, he enters a curious social category where his appearance becomes a commentary on his virility, his health, his desirability, and somehow even his character, none of which have any actual connection to the absence of follicles on a scalp. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep-seated association between hair and youth, fertility and power. Associations that evolved when these things actually mattered for survival, but now linger as pure aesthetic preference masquerading as biological imperative. We have normalized the idea that a bald man must feel diminished in some fundamental way, that he should consider his baldness a problem requiring solution, and we have built an entire industry around this manufactured insecurity, selling hair restoration treatments, transplants, and cosmetic solutions to men who are made to feel defective simply because their bodies have aged in the way bodies actually age. The remarkable thing is that this persists in a modern society that claims to value authenticity and acceptance, yet we continue to regard baldness with a kind of quiet pity, as though the bald man were incomplete, rather than simply being a man whose head happens to lack hair. The paradox deepens when we consider that many cultures throughout history have regarded baldness with indifference or even reverence, suggesting that our current discomfort with it is entirely constructed rather than innate. Imagine a simple statement written on a page before you. This sentence is false. You read it carefully, and immediately your mind begins to fold in on itself like a geometric shape trying to occupy two dimensions simultaneously. If the statement is true, then what it claims must be accurate, which means the sentence itself is false. But if the sentence is false, then its claim is incorrect, making the statement true, and round this logical wheel spins without ever finding solid ground. This ancient paradox, attributed to the Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus and later, refined by countless thinkers throughout history, represents perhaps the purest distillation of self-referential contradiction that the human mind can construct using only language and logic. The mechanism operates at the deepest level of how we assign truth values to statements. We have always assumed that every declarative sentence must be either true or false, a principle so fundamental that we rarely question it, yet when a sentence refers to itself and makes claims about its own truth value, this binary system collapses entirely. The statement creates an infinite loop of evaluation, where each determination of its truth status immediately negates itself, leaving no stable conclusion possible. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is not merely its logical impossibility, but rather our stubborn insistence that such sentences must have a definitive answer, that somewhere in the space between true and false there exists a resolution we simply have not discovered yet. We continue to contemplate the liar paradox despite centuries of rigorous mathematical and philosophical analysis, and we continue to feel the mental discomfort it produces, as though the problem lies not with our logic, but with our inability to apply it correctly, when in fact the problem may lie with the very assumptions upon which we have built our entire system of reasoning. Imagine a crocodile emerges from a river and snatches a child from the riverbank, then makes a proposition to the child's desperate parent. If you can correctly guess what I will do with your child, I will return them to you unharmed, but if you guess wrong, I will keep them forever. The parent, faced with impossible circumstances and driven by love and desperation, responds with a statement that creates a logical trap. You will not return my child. Now the crocodile finds itself bound by its own rules in a way that defies resolution, because if it returns the child, the parent's statement was false, which means the crocodile should keep the child according to the bargain, but if it keeps the child, the parent's statement was true, which means the crocodile should return the child. This ancient paradox, documented in philosophical traditions spanning from Greek logic to medieval scholasticism, presents a situation where no action the crocodile takes can satisfy the conditions it has established, creating an infinite loop of contradictory obligations that cannot be resolved through reason alone. The paradox works by exploiting the gap between predictive statements and binding promises, between what will happen and what should happen according to the rules of the bargain itself. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is not merely its logical structure, but the emotional context in which we contemplate it, the desperation of a parent forced to engage in abstract reasoning while their child's life hangs in balance, collapsing the distance between theoretical philosophy and real human suffering. We continue to discuss this paradox across centuries not because we have solved it, but because we have accepted that some logical traps cannot be escaped through cleverness alone, that they represent genuine contradictions in how language, obligation, and certainty interact, and that sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation is to recognize its impossibility as complete. Imagine a lottery where millions of tickets are sold, and only one will win the grand prize, making the odds of any individual ticket winning astronomically small, perhaps 1 in 10 million or worse. Now, if you hold a single ticket in your hand, rational thought tells you that it is almost certainly not the winning ticket, and yet millions of people purchase lottery tickets every single week with the full knowledge that their probability of winning is vanishingly small, essentially negligible from a mathematical standpoint. This is the fundamental tension at the heart of the lottery paradox. We hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously without experiencing any meaningful cognitive dissonance. We believe, on one hand, that our individual ticket will not win because the odds are impossibly against us, and yet we also act as though there is a genuine possibility that it might, purchasing the ticket and entertaining fantasies of sudden wealth. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates at the intersection of probability theory and human psychology, where our minds struggle to properly calibrate the difference between an outcome that is merely unlikely and one that is genuinely impossible. When we say that a ticket has a 1 in 10 million chance, we acknowledge the mathematical reality, but we fail to fully internalize what that number actually means in terms of our lived experience and decision-making processes. The human brain evolved to make decisions in environments where probabilities were more modest, where 1 in 100 was a meaningful distinction rather than something we could safely ignore, and our intuitions about chance remain calibrated to that ancestral context. Furthermore, the paradox persists because we have constructed an entire cultural apparatus around the lottery that validates and normalizes this contradictory thinking. The lottery is legal, widely advertised, endorsed by governments that profit from it, and surrounded by the constant cultural narrative that someone has to win, so why not you? Imagine a sweltering summer afternoon in Texas, where a family sits in an air-conditioned house playing dominoes and drinking lemonade, perfectly content in their comfortable environment. One family member suddenly suggests a drive to Abilene, a distant town 50 miles away, known for its mediocre restaurant and dusty streets. No one particularly wants to go, yet within minutes, the entire family agrees and piles into a car for the hot, uncomfortable journey. They arrive at the restaurant, eat unimpressive food, endure the long drive back in silence, and finally return home exhausted. Only then does someone admit they never wanted to go in the first place, and neither did anyone else. They all went to Abilene because they each believed the others wanted to, creating a collective decision that served no one's actual preferences. This is the Abilene Paradox, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of every individual within that group, driven entirely by the false assumption that others want something different. The mechanism underlying this paradox is fundamentally about communication breakdown and fear of social friction. Each person assumes that speaking their true preference will disappoint the group or create conflict, so they remain silent and defer to what they imagine are the group's wishes. This creates a cascade where everyone is misrepresenting themselves, yet no one realizes that everyone else is doing the same. The group moves forward on the basis of a collective fiction, a shared misunderstanding that becomes self-reinforcing because no one breaks the silence to clarify what anyone actually wants. What makes this paradox so insidious and so normalized within human society is that we encounter it constantly in workplaces, families, communities, and institutions, yet we rarely name it or acknowledge it as the waste of time and resources that it truly is. Imagine standing at the edge of a map, tracing your finger along the boundary where land meets sea, and asking yourself a seemingly innocent question: how long is this coastline? You might expect a simple answer, a number measured in kilometers or miles, something definitive and unchanging. Yet the moment you begin to measure, you discover something deeply unsettling about the nature of measurement itself. If you measure the coast of Britain using a ruler on a standard map, you might calculate it to be roughly 2,000 kilometers. But if you take a more detailed map and measure again, using the same ruler, the coastline suddenly becomes 3,000 kilometers. Switch to an even more detailed map and it stretches to 4,000 kilometers. Continue this process indefinitely, zooming in closer and closer, and the coastline's length approaches infinity, never settling on any final answer. This phenomenon is known as the Coastline Paradox, and it reveals something profoundly troubling about how we quantify the physical world. The mechanism underlying this puzzle lies in the concept of scale and self-similarity. Every coastline, when examined closely, contains smaller inlets, bays, and peninsulas that were invisible at a larger scale. When you zoom in further, these formations themselves contain even tinier features, and this pattern continues downward toward the infinitesimal. The length you measure depends entirely on the granularity of your measurement tool, not on any objective property of the coastline itself. A ruler 2 course will skip over countless small curves, while a finer ruler catches them all, extending your total measurement. This recursive, fractal nature means that coastlines exhibit what mathematicians call infinite perimeter with finite area, a property that should seem impossible, yet undeniably occurs in nature. What makes the coastline paradox particularly disorienting is that we have essentially normalized this fundamental uncertainty without ever resolving it. Imagine filling 2 identical containers with water, one at room temperature and one freshly boiled, then placing both in a freezer at the same time. According to every principle of thermodynamics we have learned and taught for centuries, the hot water should take longer to freeze because it must first cool down to room temperature before it can begin the freezing process. Yet remarkably and frustratingly for physicists everywhere, the hot water often freezes first, reaching solid ice before its cooler counterpart has finished its journey into the frozen state. This phenomenon is called the Mpemba Effect, named after Erasto Mpemba, a Tanzanian student who observed this peculiar behavior in his kitchen during the 1960s and reported it to the scientific community, though the effect itself had been noted by Aristotle over 2,000 years prior. The effect occurs reliably enough that it cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence or experimental error, yet it remains one of the most vexing paradoxes in the history of physics because no single explanation has achieved universal acceptance among researchers. Several mechanisms may contribute to this counterintuitive outcome. Evaporation removes mass from the hot water, reducing the total amount of liquid that must freeze. Convection currents in warmer water distribute heat more efficiently throughout the container. Dissolved gases escape more readily from hot water, changing its freezing properties. And supercooling, the ability of water to remain liquid below freezing point, may affect the 2 samples differently based on their initial temperatures and impurities. Yet despite decades of investigation and multiple plausible explanations, we still cannot point to any single cause and say with absolute certainty that this is why hot water sometimes freezes before cold water. The Mpemba effect persists in scientific literature as a reminder that our intuitive understanding of the physical world remains incomplete, that nature continues to harbor secrets in plain sight, and that the simplest observations often hide the most complicated truths beneath their surface. Imagine yourself standing before 3 closed doors in a television studio, facing a game show host named Monty Hall who has invited you to play a simple game for a prize. Behind one of these 3 doors sits a valuable automobile, and behind each of the other 2 doors stands a goat, a prize far less desirable than the car you hope to win. You are asked to select one door, any door you wish, though you do not yet know what lies behind it. After you have made your initial selection, the host, who knows exactly what is behind every door, opens one of the 2 remaining doors that you did not choose, deliberately revealing a goat standing there. Now you face a critical decision. You may either stay with your original choice or switch to the one remaining unopened door. The question that has puzzled millions of people and caused arguments in offices and classrooms worldwide is this: does it matter which option you choose, or are your odds of winning the same either way? The mathematical reality is counterintuitive and deeply unsettling to most human minds. When you first selected your door, you had a 1 in 3 chance of having chosen correctly. When the host opened a door to reveal a goat, the probability did not simply redistribute itself equally between your door and the remaining unopened door. Instead, the entire probability of 2/3 now concentrates itself behind that single remaining door, meaning that if you switch, you will win the car 2 times out of 3, while staying with your original choice wins you the car only 1 time out of 3. This paradox persists not because the mathematics is unclear, but because human intuition rebels against it with remarkable stubbornness. Our brains instinctively perceive the situation after one door opens as a fresh start with equal odds, a clean slate where each remaining option seems equally likely. we struggle to internalize that the host's action was not random, that it was guided by complete knowledge and purposeful elimination of information. In 1935, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposed a thought experiment that would become one of the most haunting illustrations of quantum mechanics ever conceived. And in doing so, he inadvertently created a paradox that challenges our fundamental understanding of reality itself. Imagine a sealed box containing a living cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison, all arranged so that if the atom decays and triggers the counter, the poison is released and the cat dies, but if the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive. Once the box is sealed, we have no way of knowing whether the decay occurred or not without opening it to observe, and according to quantum mechanics, the atom exists in a superposition of states, simultaneously decayed and undecayed, until observation collapses the wave function and forces reality to choose. The terrible implication is that the cat, connected to this quantum system, must also exist in a superposition of both alive and dead at the same time, a ghostly coexistence of contradictory states that cannot rationally be reconciled. The psychological mechanism at work here is the collision between two irreconcilable truths. Our everyday experience tells us that a cat must be definitively one or the other, that death and life are mutually exclusive states that cannot occupy the same space. Yet the mathematics of quantum mechanics insists that superposition is real, and that observation is the only force that resolves ambiguity into singular reality. We find ourselves suspended in an intellectual vertigo where the act of looking at something actually determines its nature, where reality does not exist in a fixed state, but rather awaits our witness to become real. What makes this paradox so persistent is that we have never actually resolved it, only learned to live with the discomfort of it, and physicists continue to debate whether the cat is truly in superposition, whether decoherence resolves the problem, or whether parallel universes branch out at every moment of uncertainty, creating versions of ourselves in worlds where the cat lived and worlds where it did not. Imagine two identical twins born on Earth at the same moment, sharing the same genes, the same upbringing, the same experiences for their entire lives. Yet one remains here while the other boards a spacecraft traveling at nearly the speed of light and journeys through the cosmos for what feels like 10 years before returning home. According to Einstein's theory of special relativity, time itself is not absolute but relative to the observer's motion and gravitational field, meaning the traveling twin will have aged far less than the twin who remained stationary on Earth, perhaps only aging 5 years while their sibling aged 10. When the spacecraft lands and the travelers embrace, they discover an impossible situation has unfolded. The departed twin is now noticeably younger, their cells fresher, their hair less gray, their biological clock having ticked more slowly simply because they moved through space at tremendous velocity. And this is not a theoretical abstraction, but a measurable physical reality confirmed countless times through atomic clocks on airplanes and satellites moving around our planet. The paradox emerges from our intuitive understanding that time should be universal and unchanging, that aging should progress identically for all observers regardless of their location or movement, yet the universe operates according to different rules than our everyday experience suggests. We persist in feeling that this phenomenon should somehow resolve itself, that relativity must contain some hidden flaw or exception that would restore our comfortable sense of temporal uniformity, because our evolution equipped us to navigate a world of slow speeds and weak gravity where relativistic effects remain imperceptible, and nothing in our biological history prepared us to accept that the passage of time itself can stretch and compress depending on velocity. Imagine the legendary warrior Achilles, fastest of all mortals, preparing to race against a tortoise in a foot race across an open plain, and imagine, too, that the tortoise is granted a head start, perhaps 50 meters ahead before Achilles even begins to move, a seeming trivial advantage for a creature so painfully slow compared to the demigod pursuing him. The paradox unfolds through a deceptively elegant logical argument. By the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise began, the tortoise will have moved forward some distance, perhaps 5 meters ahead, and then when Achilles covers that 5 meters, the tortoise will have shuffled forward again by another half meter, and this process continues infinitely, with the gap perpetually closing but theoretically never quite reaching zero, suggesting that Achilles, despite being faster, would never actually overtake his shelled competitor, and that motion itself might be impossible. The mechanism behind this ancient paradox, first formulated by Zeno of Elea around 2400 years ago, operates through the power of infinite series and the human mind's intuitive discomfort with infinity. For while each successive gap between Achilles and the tortoise does become smaller, our reasoning tells us that an infinite number of steps must be completed before the race concludes, and completing infinite steps seems to require infinite time. Yet mathematically, we now understand that infinite series can converge to finite sums, meaning infinite steps can indeed be traversed in a finite duration. A resolution that reveals the paradox not as proof that motion is impossible, but rather as evidence that our intuitions about infinity poorly match mathematical reality. Imagine you are standing at one end of a room and you wish to walk to the opposite wall. Before you can reach that wall, you must first travel half the distance to it, which means covering half the room. But before you can cover that half, you must cover half of that half, which is a quarter of the room. And before you can cover a quarter, you must cover half of that quarter, which is an eighth of the room. This process continues infinitely backward into smaller and smaller distances that must be traversed before you can even take your first step. According to the logic of this paradox, attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, you should never be able to move at all, because you would need to complete an infinite number of smaller journeys before accomplishing any single journey. Yet here you stand, capable of walking across rooms, running down hallways, and traveling across entire continents with relative ease. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on a fundamental confusion between the mathematical concept of infinity and the physical reality of continuous motion. The paradox assumes that an infinite number of steps must take an infinite amount of time to complete, when in fact an infinite series of progressively smaller intervals can sum to a finite total. Each half of the remaining distance takes proportionally less time to traverse, and these diminishing time intervals add up to a perfectly reasonable, measurable duration. Our minds struggle with this concept because we intuitively think of infinity as something that never concludes, yet mathematics proves that infinite division can still result in finite quantities. We have normalized this paradox by simply ignoring it and living our lives, moving our bodies through space without hesitation or philosophical doubt. We do not pause before each step to contemplate whether we can actually take it. We have relegated this paradox to the realm of intellectual curiosity rather than practical concern, treating it as a quirk of ancient philosophy rather than a genuine threat to our understanding of how the world functions. Consider an arrow in flight, moving from a bow toward a distant target through the air, and imagine trying to understand how this motion is actually possible at all. Zeno of Elea, an ancient Greek philosopher, constructed an argument suggesting that at any single moment in time, the arrow occupies a space equal to its own length, and if it occupies a space equal to its own length, then it is not moving at that moment, because moving would require it to occupy a space larger than itself. He then reasoned that since time is composed entirely of these indivisible moments, and the arrow is not moving in any of them, then the arrow cannot be moving at all, yet we observe it moving anyway. The paradox emerges from the seemingly irrefutable logic that if something is stationary at every instant, it must be stationary overall, and yet arrows do reach their targets and motion manifestly occurs in the world before our eyes. The psychological mechanism that keeps this paradox alive in our minds, despite centuries of mathematical and philosophical resolution, is that it exploits a fundamental confusion between different types of stillness and different ways of measuring change over time. We think of motion as something that should be observable within a single frozen moment, like a photograph, but motion is actually a relationship between positions across multiple moments, something that only becomes visible when we allow time to progress. The calculus developed by Newton and Leibniz provided precise mathematical language for describing instantaneous rates of change, showing that velocity at an instant can be rigorously defined without requiring the object to move within that instant. Yet the paradox persists in casual thought because our intuitive understanding of time still wants to treat moments as discrete units rather than as limit points in a continuum. Consider the sheer mathematical improbability of our solitude in the cosmos, a question that physicist Enrico Fermi posed so elegantly in 1950 when he asked, quite simply, where is everybody? The observable universe contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each harboring hundreds of billions of stars, and modern astronomy suggests that planets are not rare occurrences, but rather the norm, orbiting most stars in existence. Given the age of the universe, approximately 13.8 billion years old, and the relatively brief existence of human civilization spanning merely thousands of years, the probability calculus seems overwhelming. Intelligent life should have emerged elsewhere, should have developed technologies, should have colonized distant worlds, and should have left detectable signals or evidence of their presence across the electromagnetic spectrum. Yet when we point our most sophisticated instruments toward the heavens and listen intently for any whisper of alien communication, we encounter only silence, an absence so profound and perplexing that it has become known as the Great Silence. The psychological weight of this paradox operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It forces us to confront our apparent cosmic isolation while simultaneously challenging the logical framework upon which we construct our understanding of probability and life itself. We have normalized this silence through a kind of intellectual compartmentalization, developing what scientists call the rare earth hypothesis, postulating that perhaps intelligent life requires an extraordinarily specific convergence of conditions so improbable that Earth represents a statistical anomaly rather than a common occurrence. We have also retreated into explanations involving the Fermi filter, a theoretical barrier that either prevents most civilizations from reaching advanced stages of development or emerges after they achieve such advancement, suggesting that self-destruction or cosmic catastrophe awaits all technological species. If the universe is infinite and contains an infinite number of stars distributed throughout space, then every line of sight from Earth should eventually terminate at the surface of a star, meaning that the night sky should be entirely covered in light and should blaze as brightly as the surface of the sun itself. Yet when we look up at night, we see vast stretches of darkness punctuated only by discrete points of light, a contradiction that has puzzled astronomers and philosophers for centuries. The paradox emerges from a deceptively simple logical chain. If space extends forever in all directions and stars are scattered throughout it with reasonable density, then the amount of starlight reaching us should increase dramatically as we peer deeper into the cosmos, and mathematically, the total light intensity should approach infinity, creating a universe that exists in constant, overwhelming daylight from every conceivable angle. Instead, the night sky remains predominantly black, a phenomenon so fundamental to our experience that we rarely question it until the mathematics forces us to confront the impossibility of what we observe. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in our tendency to assume that an infinite, static, and unchanging universe should produce uniform and predictable results from simple geometric principles. Yet reality operates under constraints that our intuitive reasoning overlooks, such as the finite speed of light, the expansion of the universe itself, the finite age of the cosmos, the absorption of light by interstellar dust, and the fact that distant stars appear dimmer according to the inverse square law, each factor contributing to darkening the night sky in ways that our initial assumptions failed to account for. A judge tells a prisoner that he will be executed by hanging sometime during the following week, but with one crucial condition: the execution will be a surprise, and the prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the morning of his death. The prisoner, believing himself to be logical, begins to reason through the problem with what seems like unassailable certainty. He concludes that the execution cannot occur on Friday, because if he survives through Thursday, then Friday would be the only remaining day, making it no longer a surprise. Working backwards with this same logic, he eliminates Thursday for the same reason, then Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday, until he has convinced himself that the execution cannot occur at all. Yet the execution does occur, and it is indeed a surprise, because the prisoner's logical deduction has created a false sense of security that blinds him to the actual outcome. The paradox emerges from a fundamental collision between two competing systems of reasoning: the mathematical logic that seems to guarantee the prisoner's safety and the practical reality that contradicts it entirely. The prisoner's error lies in assuming that his private knowledge of his own reasoning somehow constrains the judge's ability to act, when in fact the prisoner's confidence in his logical proof becomes the very mechanism through which surprise is preserved. Once the prisoner has reasoned that execution is impossible, he abandons his vigilance, and the judge can execute him on any day with genuine unexpectedness. The paradox persists because it reveals something unsettling about the nature of self-referential knowledge and the limits of logical systems when applied to real situations involving human agency and deception. It demonstrates that perfect logical reasoning can sometimes lead us into traps of our own making, where the very act of trying to escape an outcome through reasoning creates the conditions for that outcome to occur. Imagine two suspects arrested for a serious crime, separated into different interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with one another, facing a choice that will define the outcome of their case and their freedom. Each prisoner is told the same thing. If you betray your partner by confessing and testifying against them while they remain silent, you will walk free while they receive 10 years in prison. But if you both stay silent, you will each receive only 1 year on a lesser charge, and if you both confess, you will each receive 5 years. The logical paradox emerges not from the rules themselves, but from the fact that individual rationality and collective rationality point in opposite directions, creating a trap that ensnares even the most intelligent decision-makers. From each prisoner's perspective alone, confessing always yields a better outcome than staying silent regardless of what the other person does. Yet when both prisoners follow this perfectly logical individual reasoning, they both end up worse off than if they had simply cooperated and remained silent together. This structural impossibility, this mathematical inevitability of mutual betrayal, despite mutual benefit from cooperation, has become far more than a theoretical puzzle confined to interrogation rooms and academic philosophy. For it describes an underlying pattern that repeats across human civilization in arms races between nations who spend fortunes on weapons neither truly wants to use, in business competition where price wars leave all companies poorer, in environmental destruction where individual incentives to pollute override collective survival, and in countless everyday interactions where trust could benefit everyone but fear of being the only one who cooperates leaves us all trapped in suboptimal outcomes. Imagine you are stirring a cup of tea with a spoon, moving the liquid in a circular motion, watching the leaves swirl around in concentric patterns, and yet the leaves do not fly outward toward the rim of the cup as physics might suggest they should, but instead they gather toward the center, collecting in a small pile at the bottom where the motion is slowest and gentlest, defying the centrifugal force that seems so intuitively obvious to our everyday understanding of how objects should behave when spun. This phenomenon, first documented in the 1800s, but experienced countless times in kitchens and cafes around the world, represents a collision between our intuitive sense of how the world works and the actual mechanical reality of fluid dynamics. When you spin the tea by moving a spoon in circles, you create layers of motion where the liquid in the center moves slower than the liquid at the edges. And as these different speeds interact with the curved surface of the cup and the friction between the liquid and the container itself, a secondary circulation is created that actually pushes the tea leaves inward rather than outward, a phenomenon known as the secondary flow or the Ekman spiral in more technical contexts. What makes this paradox so persistently confusing is that it operates entirely contrary to our developed intuition about spinning objects, the same intuition that tells us a stone on a string will fly away if released, that carnival rides threaten to throw you outward, that the whole world of rotation behaves according to centrifugal force. Yet here in this humble cup of tea is proof that nature is far more subtle and layered than our surface-level understanding allows, teaching us that the same force can produce opposite effects depending on the scale and context in which it operates, a lesson we nod at intellectually once it is explained, but somehow forget the moment we stop thinking about it and return to stirring our tea. Consider the moment in history when the steam engine became dramatically more efficient at converting coal into usable energy, a technological triumph that should have fundamentally reduced our consumption of coal and eased the strain on natural resources. Instead, the opposite occurred. Coal consumption in Victorian England actually skyrocketed, reaching unprecedented levels despite the improved efficiency of the machines themselves. This counterintuitive phenomenon was observed and documented by economist William Stanley Jevons in the 1860s, and it revealed something troubling about human nature and economic systems that continues to perplex us to this day. The mechanism behind this paradox operates on a deceptively simple principle rooted in basic economics and human behavior. When something becomes more efficient, it becomes cheaper to use, and when something becomes cheaper, we use considerably more of it rather than using the same amount and calling it a victory. A more efficient engine meant lower operational costs, which meant coal became more affordable, which meant factories could run more machines, more people could heat their homes during winter, and more industries could emerge that previously could not afford to operate at scale. The paradox extends far beyond the historical example of coal and steam, manifesting itself in our contemporary world with unsettling regularity. As automobiles became more fuel efficient, we drove more miles. As lighting technology improved from incandescent to LED, we filled our homes and streets with exponentially more lights. As renewable energy sources became cheaper and more efficient, our total energy consumption continued climbing rather than declining. We seem fundamentally unable to satisfy ourselves with the gains that efficiency provides, instead treating efficiency as an invitation to expand our consumption rather than as an opportunity to preserve resources or maintain our previous level of usage with reduced environmental impact. In the late 1800s, a Scottish economist named Robert Giffen observed something that seemed to violate the most basic laws of supply and demand, something that should not exist according to classical economic theory, yet there it was, functioning in plain sight within the poorest communities of industrial Britain. When the price of bread increased, people did not buy less of it as economic models predicted they should. Instead, they bought more of it, as though the rising costs somehow made it more desirable or necessary. This phenomenon became known as the Giffen Good, named after the man who documented it, and it represents a crack in the foundation of how we understand rational economic behavior. The mechanism at work here operates through a principle called the income effect, which occurs when the price of a staple commodity becomes so expensive that it consumes an ever larger portion of a poor household's budget, leaving them with almost nothing to spend on more nutritious or desirable foods, forcing them to actually increase their consumption of the cheap commodity simply to have enough calories to survive, because the alternative, buying less bread while prices rise, would leave them even hungrier and worse off financially. It is a paradox born not from desire or preference, but from desperation and the mathematics of scarcity, where a person earning minimal wages discovers that, as bread prices climb, they must paradoxically purchase more of it while cutting back on everything else, creating an inverse relationship between price and demand that economics had deemed impossible. What makes this paradox so unsettling is how it reveals that our economic models are built upon assumptions of choice and agency that simply do not apply to those living at subsistence levels, where the laws of supply and demand function differently because survival itself becomes the only rational calculation, and the behavior that seems irrational from a distance becomes perfectly logical when you understand that you are choosing between buying bread or buying anything else at all. In the years following World War II, American economist Wassily Leontief conducted an analysis of international trade that should have confirmed what economic theory had predicted for nearly 2 centuries. That nations export products made from their most abundant resources and import products that require scarce resources. The United States in 1953 possessed an enormous capital surplus and relatively scarce labor compared to other industrialized nations, which meant, according to classical economic doctrine, that America should export capital-intensive goods while importing labor-intensive goods from countries where workers were plentiful and cheap. Yet when Leontief examined the actual trade data, he discovered something that contradicted this fundamental principle so completely that it has puzzled economists ever since. American exports were actually labor-intensive, while American imports were capital-intensive, precisely the opposite of what theory demanded. The nation with the world's greatest abundance of capital was exporting products that required abundant labor to produce, while importing goods that demanded significant capital investment. This inversion became known as the Leontief Paradox, and its discovery sent shockwaves through economic academia because it suggested that the entire theoretical framework economists had relied upon for understanding international commerce was somehow incomplete or fundamentally flawed. Decades of scholarly investigation have proposed various explanations: that American labor possessed superior skills and training, making it more valuable than raw quantity; that the United States specialized in technology-intensive production that appeared labor-intensive on the surface; that trade barriers and tariffs distorted natural patterns; or that capital itself took different forms in different nations. Imagine a scenario where an entire group moves together in one direction, and yet somehow the average of that group improves even though no individual member has actually gotten better. This is the Will Rogers phenomenon, named after a quote often attributed to the American humorist who once remarked that when Okies left Oklahoma during the Great Depression, they raised the average intelligence of both states. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When the lowest performing members of a group leave or are removed, the average performance of the remaining group increases automatically, not because anyone improved, but because the calculation itself has fundamentally changed. Consider a school where struggling students are transferred to a different institution. Suddenly, the average test scores of the original school climb dramatically, yet the transferred students have not become worse at academics, and the remaining students have not become better. The math is inescapable. Remove the lowest values from a dataset and the mean necessarily rises, a pure statistical artifact divorced entirely from reality. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is how it masquerades as genuine progress in countless real-world contexts, from hospital mortality statistics that improve when sicker patients are transferred elsewhere, to corporate metrics that surge after layoffs eliminate lower performers, to graduation rate improvements that occur simply because struggling students are pushed out rather than supported. We have essentially built entire systems around this mathematical illusion, celebrating gains that represent nothing more than selective reorganization rather than meaningful advancement. The phenomenon persists because it aligns perfectly with our existing biases and institutional incentives. It allows organizations to claim success without doing the harder work of actually improving outcomes, and it offers a convenient narrative where problems are solved by removal rather than investment. Imagine a city with two main routes connecting the same starting point to the same destination, and commuters have distributed themselves across these roads in a way that produces a certain average travel time. Now imagine that city planners, seeking to improve traffic flow, add a new road that connects the two existing routes, creating a shortcut that theoretically should make travel faster for everyone. One would expect that offering drivers more options, particularly a more direct path, would reduce congestion and decrease overall travel times across the network. Yet when this new road opens, something counterintuitive happens. The average travel time for all commuters increases, sometimes significantly, even though every individual driver still has access to the same roads they did before, plus one additional option. This is Brice's paradox, named after the mathematician Dietrich Brice, who discovered it in 1968, a phenomenon where adding capacity to a network can paradoxically worsen performance for everyone. The mechanism at work here involves the invisible hand of individual optimization turning against collective welfare. Each driver, attempting to find the fastest route for themselves, gravitates toward the new shortcut because it appears more efficient. As more drivers make this individually rational choice, the shortcut becomes congested, and traffic backs up not just on the new road, but on the sections of the original routes that feed into it. The network reaches a new equilibrium, but this equilibrium is worse than the previous one because drivers have collectively optimized themselves into a state where the benefit of the additional route is entirely consumed by the increased congestion it generates. The paradox reveals a fundamental truth about complex systems. That rationality at the individual level does not guarantee optimization at the collective level, and that removing constraints can sometimes be more beneficial than adding capacity. Imagine a medical study comparing two hospitals, and Hospital A shows better survival rates than Hospital B when you examine the data overall. Yet when you break down the same data by individual disease categories, Hospital B somehow outperforms Hospital A in nearly every single disease type, creating a reversal of conclusions that seems to defy the very laws of mathematics and logic. This is Simpson's paradox, a phenomenon where a trend that appears in aggregated data completely reverses itself when that data is separated into distinct subgroups, challenging our fundamental intuitions about how statistics should behave in a rational universe. The mechanism driving this paradox lies in a deceptively simple but often invisible factor: the composition and distribution of the groups being compared. In the hospital example, Hospital B might actually treat far more critical cases than Hospital A, meaning they're dealing with inherently sicker patients whose lower overall survival rates weren't due to inferior care, but rather to the severity of illness they received. When researchers separate patients by disease type and control for this confounding factor, Hospital B's superior treatment outcomes within each category become apparent. Yet the aggregate comparison painted a misleading picture that violated the logical expectation that trends should remain consistent across different levels of analysis. What makes Simpson's paradox particularly unsettling is that it reveals a profound blindness in how we interpret numerical information, suggesting that our statistical intuitions can be catastrophically wrong without any mathematical error occurring whatsoever. The paradox persists in countless real-world decisions about hiring discrimination, educational performance, and pharmaceutical efficacy, often remaining invisible until someone bothers to examine the data's internal structure, which we rarely do when headlines and summaries seem to tell a clear story. Imagine you are presented with two sealed envelopes by someone you trust completely. You are told that one envelope contains twice as much money as the other, but you do not know which is which. You are allowed to open one envelope, examine its contents, and then decide whether you want to switch to the other envelope or keep the one you have opened. Let us say you open the first envelope and find it contains $100. Now the paradox emerges with peculiar force. You reason that the other envelope either contains $50 or $200 with what seems like equal probability. If you switch, your expected value is half of $50, which is $25, plus half of $200, which is $100, totaling $125. Since $125 is greater than the $100 you currently hold, the mathematics appears to compel you to switch. Yet here is where the trap reveals itself with devastating elegance. This exact same reasoning applies regardless of which envelope you opened first. If you had opened the second envelope instead and found any amount whatsoever, the identical calculation would suggest you should switch to the other one. You cannot rationally switch to both envelopes simultaneously, yet the logic seemingly demands it. The paradox persists because our intuitions about probability and expectation values break down when we apply them to situations involving unknown base rates and infinite possibility spaces. The flaw lurks in our assumption that once we observe a specific value, the probabilities of the hidden envelope remain equal, when in fact the observation itself should update our beliefs about the initial probability distribution. We have normalized this paradox into mathematical folklore, a problem that appears in textbooks and philosophical discussions, yet continues to perplex even those who understand its resolution, because the emotional pull of the expected value calculation never quite releases its grip on our reasoning. Imagine a casino in 18th century Russia where a peculiar game is being offered to you, a game so mathematically absurd that it reveals something fundamental about how we value money and risk. A fair coin is flipped repeatedly, and you are paid based on how long the sequence of heads continues. If heads appears once, you receive $2. If it appears twice in a row, you receive $4. If 3 times, $8, and so on, doubling with each consecutive head until the coin finally lands on tails and the game ends. The question posed by Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 is deceptively simple. How much would you rationally pay to play this game? The mathematical answer, when calculated through expected value, suggests you should pay an infinite amount of money because the infinite series of possible outcomes, each weighted by their probability, adds up to infinity itself. If you flip once and get tails immediately, you win $2 with probability of 1/2. If you get 2 heads then tails, you win $4 with probability of 1/4. If you get 3 heads then tails, you win $8 with probability of 1/8, and this pattern continues forever, creating a sum that never converges to any finite number. Yet in reality, virtually no rational person would pay even $20 to play, let alone thousands or millions, revealing the profound disconnect between mathematical theory and human psychology. Bernoulli himself recognized this contradiction and proposed that we do not value money according to its face amount, but rather according to its diminishing marginal utility, meaning that each additional dollar brings us less satisfaction than the previous one. So an additional dollar to a wealthy person means far less than an additional dollar to someone poor. This elegant solution suggests that our preferences are not irrational, but rather that the mathematical model of expected value was incomplete, failing to account for how humans actually experience and value increments of wealth. Imagine a scenario where an incredibly powerful being, perhaps an advanced artificial intelligence or a perfect predictor of human behavior, has observed you for years and understands how you think with near-perfect accuracy. This being presents you with 2 boxes, one opaque and one transparent. The transparent box contains $1,000, which you can see clearly. The opaque box contains either $1 million or nothing at all, and the predictor has already made its decision before you arrived. The predictor's rule is elegantly simple. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left the opaque box empty. But if it predicted you would take only the opaque box, it filled that box with $1 million. You stand before these boxes knowing the predictor's perfect track record, and you must choose. Do you take both boxes or only the opaque one? This paradox reveals a fundamental tension between two powerful forms of reasoning that typically serve us well but suddenly conflict in this scenario. On one hand, causal decision theory argues that since the predictor has already made its choice before you act, your decision cannot change what is already in the boxes, so you should take both and guarantee yourself at least $1,000 plus whatever might be inside the opaque box. On the other hand, evidential decision theory suggests that if you take both boxes, that very action is strong evidence that the predictor predicted you would be greedy, which means the opaque box is empty. Whereas choosing only the opaque box is evidence the predictor knew you would be rational and disciplined, meaning it is filled with $1 million. The paradox persists because it exposes how our intuitions about decision-making, causation, and rationality can splinter when dealing with scenarios involving perfect prediction and retroactive logical dependency, forcing us to confront whether we truly understand what it means to make a free choice in a world where our behavior might be predictable. Imagine you are waiting in line at a government office or a hospital and you notice something peculiar. The moment an official inspector arrives to evaluate the quality of service, everything changes dramatically. The staff suddenly becomes attentive, the waiting area is immaculate, the procedures run smoothly, and customers are treated with remarkable efficiency. Yet the moment the inspector leaves, things return to their previous state of disorganization and neglect. This phenomenon is known as the inspection paradox, and it reveals something deeply troubling about how institutions function and how we collectively conspire to maintain illusions. The paradox emerges because the inspection itself becomes a performance rather than an accurate measure of reality. The institution knows it will be evaluated on a particular day, and so it marshals its resources, its best personnel, and its most conscientious behavior exclusively for that moment, creating a false baseline that the inspector believes represents the normal standard of operation. What makes this truly paradoxical is that everyone involved understands this is occurring, yet the system persists unchanged. The inspectors are not naive. They are often aware that improvements may be temporary, yet they must rely on what they observe during their visit because they cannot be present at all times. The staff knows the inspection will pass because they have engineered the circumstances to ensure it, while the institution's leadership accepts this cycle as simply the cost of maintaining accreditation or passing regulatory review. The deeper mechanism at work involves the misalignment between what we measure and what actually matters, combined with our collective acceptance that perfect systems are impossible and therefore good performance on a single day is sufficient proof of general adequacy. Imagine a medical test that detects a rare disease with 99% accuracy, and you take it, and it comes back positive. Your immediate instinct is to assume you almost certainly have the disease because the test is 99% accurate, which sounds overwhelming in its reliability. Yet the paradox emerges when we examine the actual mathematics beneath this seemingly straightforward scenario. If the disease is genuinely rare, affecting only 1 in 10,000 people in the general population, then a positive result from an imperfect test, even one with exceptional accuracy, does not actually tell you what you think it tells you. In fact, even with 99% accuracy, the probability that you actually have the disease after a positive test result might be less than 10%, because the sheer rarity of the disease means that false positives vastly outnumber true positives in the population. This is the cruel mathematics of conditional probability, where our intuitive understanding of accuracy completely fails us in the presence of rare events. The mechanism driving this paradox lies in how our minds process information sequentially rather than probabilistically. We hear the word positive, and we hear the word 99% accurate, and we combine them into a narrative of near certainty, without accounting for the prior probability, without considering the base rate, without asking how many people would test positive even if they did not have the disease. This same paradox haunts spam filters that achieve 95% accuracy, but still let countless false alerts through our inboxes. It affects security screenings at airports where the actual threat is so uncommon that most alerts catch innocent travelers. And it influences cancer screenings where millions of women receive false positive mammograms that generate enormous anxiety and unnecessary procedures. Imagine 3 identical boxes sitting before you on a table, and you're told that one box contains 2 gold coins, another contains 2 silver coins, and the final box contains 1 gold coin and 1 silver coin. You reach into a box without looking and withdraw a single coin, and it glimmers gold in the light. Now you must guess what the remaining coin in that box must be, and the question seems straightforward enough. Is it gold or silver? Your intuition suggests an even probability, 50-50 odds, because after all you have eliminated one possibility and two remain. Yet if you examine the mathematics carefully, you will discover that the probability the remaining coin is gold is actually 2/3, not 1/2, and this counterintuitive result is what troubles the mind in Bertrand's box. The mechanism at work here involves conditional probability and the way our minds unconsciously weight possibilities. When you drew the gold coin, you did not draw from all possibilities equally. You drew from a specific subset of outcomes. The gold coin you hold could have come from the box with 2 gold coins, or it could have come from the mixed box. The all-gold box presents 2 distinct ways to draw a gold coin on your first pull, while the mixed box presents only one way. Therefore, it is twice as likely you drew from the all-gold box, making the remaining coin gold in 2 out of 3 possible scenarios. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in human thinking is that our minds naturally flatten probabilities and assume symmetry where none exists. We see the problem after drawing and think only of the present state, the box before us, forgetting that the act of drawing itself encoded information about which box we were likely pulling from. We have normalized this intuitive mistake so thoroughly that many people, even those trained in mathematics, initially resist the correct answer and must work through the logic step by step before accepting what the numbers unmistakably reveal. Imagine a simple scenario. A family has 2 children, and you learn that at least one of them is a boy. Given this information, what is the probability that both children are boys? Most people instinctively answer 1/2, reasoning that if one child is a boy, the other child is equally likely to be a boy or a girl, so the odds are 50-50. However, the mathematically correct answer is actually 1/3, and this counterintuitive result has perplexed logicians, statisticians, and casual thinkers for decades, creating a paradox that seems to violate our most basic assumptions about probability and information. The mechanism behind this puzzle lies in how we interpret the given information and what possibilities we're actually considering. When we know that at least one child is a boy, we're eliminating only one scenario from the 4 equally likely original possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, and girl-girl. The boy-girl and girl-boy scenarios are actually distinct outcomes depending on birth order, and both contain at least one boy, so they remain in our sample space. This leaves us with 3 equally probable scenarios where at least one boy exists: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. Only one of these 3 scenarios has 2 boys, which gives us the 1/3 probability. What makes this problem persistently confusing is that our natural language and intuition about probability clash with the mathematical reality, and different ways of phrasing the problem seem to yield different answers depending on whether we're told the gender of a specific child or merely that at least one is a boy. People continue to struggle with this problem because our brains evolved to handle everyday probability in rough approximations rather than precise conditional calculations. And the gap between how we naturally think about such problems and how mathematics demands we think about them remains stubbornly wide, revealing a fundamental limitation in how our minds process information about uncertainty. Imagine you are tasked with drawing a random chord inside a circle, a line segment that connects 2 points on the circle's circumference, and you must determine the probability that this chord will be longer than the side of an equilateral triangle inscribed within that same circle. This problem, posed by French mathematician Joseph Bertrand in 1889, seems straightforward enough on the surface, yet it reveals a profound and unsettling truth about the nature of randomness itself. The paradox emerges not from any flaw in mathematics, but rather from the realization that there are multiple equally valid methods for generating this random chord, and each method produces a completely different answer. If you select 2 random points on the circumference and connect them, the probability is 1/3. If you instead pick a random radius and a random point along that radius, the probability becomes 1/2. And if you choose a random point anywhere within the circle and draw a chord perpendicular to the radius passing through that point, the probability becomes 3/4. All 3 approaches are logically sound, all 3 follow the rules of probability, yet they yield mutually exclusive results, which should be impossible. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in what we might call the deceptive nature of the word random itself. When we say something is random or selected arbitrarily, we believe we are invoking a concept with absolute clarity, yet randomness without a specified distribution is fundamentally ambiguous. The problem does not tell us how the randomness should be distributed across the possible space, and different natural interpretations of what random means lead inexorably to different probability distributions. The circle contains an infinite number of possible chords, and the way we weight or measure these infinite possibilities determines everything. There is no objectively correct way to select a random chord without first deciding what property of the chord will be determined randomly: its endpoints, its midpoint, its angle, its distance from the center. Imagine you have a sphere, and you want to know the probability that a random point on its surface falls within a certain region, say the northern hemisphere. The mathematics seems straightforward at first, and yet the moment you begin to formalize the problem with different coordinate systems, the answer transforms. If you use Cartesian coordinates and calculate the conditional probability based on a great circle, you arrive at one numerical result. If you instead use spherical coordinates and approach the same geometric question from a different parametrization, you receive a different answer entirely. Neither calculation contains an error. Neither mathematician has made a mistake in their reasoning. The paradox emerges from the fundamental recognition that conditional probability requires specifying not merely an event, but also the method by which that event is defined, and different coordinate systems impose different geometric weightings upon the same underlying space. This means that the phrase, "a random point on the northern hemisphere," does not possess an unambiguous meaning until you commit yourself to a specific mathematical framework for generating randomness on the sphere's surface. The Borel-Kolmogorov Paradox reveals that probability itself contains an invisible dependency on convention, on the arbitrary choices we make about how to measure and parametrize a space. What appears to be an objective mathematical truth about randomness fractures into multiple truths based on perspective. We have largely normalized this peculiar discovery by treating it as a technical detail, a reminder that one must always be careful when specifying conditional probability distributions. Yet the paradox persists in the background of probability theory like an unresolved tension, suggesting that randomness and likelihood are not pure properties of the universe itself, but rather emerge from the interaction between an observer's measurement apparatus and the structure of the space being observed. Imagine you are presented with two separate gambling games, each one deliberately designed to work against you. In the first game, you flip a coin, and if it lands on heads, you win $1, but if it lands on tails, you lose $1.01, guaranteeing that over time you will lose money with mathematical certainty. The second game operates similarly, but with different odds that are equally unfavorable to your financial interests. Now here is where the paradox emerges with almost supernatural elegance. If you play these two losing games in a carefully alternating sequence, switching back and forth between them according to a specific pattern or even random selection, you can somehow transform two guaranteed paths to financial ruin into a guaranteed path to profit. This phenomenon, discovered by physicist Juan Parando in 1996, seems to violate the fundamental principle that losing games should remain losing regardless of how you combine them. Yet the mathematics proves inexorably that under the right conditions, the combination of two negative expectation scenarios can create a positive expectation outcome. The mechanism behind this counterintuitive result lies in the way the games interact with each other through memory and state dependence. When you alternate between the two games, the outcome of one game can subtly alter the conditions under which the next game is played, creating asymmetries that your intuition never anticipated. The losing nature of each individual game comes from specific probabilities that are designed to work in isolation, but when layered together in sequence, they create unexpected correlations and dependent events that flip the mathematical advantage entirely in your favor. What makes this paradox so profoundly unsettling is that it exposes the limitations of our linear thinking about probability and gain. We are conditioned to believe that combining bad situations can only produce worse situations, yet Parando's paradox demonstrates that complexity and sequence can reorganize the landscape of outcomes in ways that seem almost like cheating against mathematics itself. Imagine a woman named Beauty who agrees to participate in an unusual experiment that will test the very nature of probability and self-awareness. And on Sunday evening, she is put to sleep by researchers who will flip a fair coin to determine what happens next. If the coin lands on heads, Beauty will be awakened on Monday, interviewed about her credence regarding the coin flip, and then given a drug to erase her memory of the entire experience before being sent back to sleep until Tuesday when the experiment ends. If the coin lands on tails, however, Beauty will be awakened on Monday, interviewed with the same question about the coin flip, given the memory-erasing drug, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed once more with the same question, and then finally released when the experiment concludes. The critical puzzle emerges when we ask Beauty a seemingly simple question each time she wakes. What is your credence that the coin landed on heads? The paradox unfolds because there are two entirely defensible answers that contradict one another. From one perspective, Beauty should answer one half, because from her subjective viewpoint before the experiment began, the coin was fair and the probability of heads remained 50%, and no new information should logically alter this assessment since she cannot remember previous awakenings and cannot distinguish between Monday and Tuesday. From another equally compelling perspective, Beauty should answer 1/3, because from the perspective of counting all possible observer moments in the experiment, there are three equally likely scenarios in which Beauty wakes up: heads on Monday, tails on Monday, and tails on Tuesday, meaning that she is twice as likely to be in a tails scenario whenever she finds herself conscious. Imagine yourself facing two separate scenarios, each offering a choice between two gambles, and in both cases you are asked what you would prefer to do with your money. In the first scenario, you are presented with a choice between a sure thing, receiving $1 million with absolute certainty, or taking a gamble where you have a 99% chance of winning $1 million, a 1% chance of winning $5 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing at all. Most people, when asked this question, choose the certain $1 million, finding comfort in the guaranteed outcome and rejecting the small possibility of complete loss despite the potential for greater gain. Now consider the second scenario, which seems mathematically similar but is framed differently. You are offered either a 1% chance of winning $1 million with 99% chance of nothing, or alternatively, a 1% chance of winning $5 million with 99% chance of nothing. When facing these odds, the same people who chose certainty in the first scenario suddenly shift their preference and choose the gamble offering $5 million, preferring the larger potential payoff when the certainty is removed from the equation. This reversal reveals what economist Maurice Allais discovered in 1953. Our decision-making processes are fundamentally inconsistent with the rational choice theory that had dominated economics and mathematics for centuries. Paradox emerges because the two scenarios are actually mathematically equivalent in their expected value calculations, yet human psychology responds to them in opposite ways depending on how they are presented. The mechanism driving this inconsistency lies in our psychological relationship with certainty itself, where the presence of a guaranteed outcome creates a disproportionate psychological comfort that influences our choices far more than rational probability mathematics would suggest. Imagine you are presented with an urn containing exactly 100 balls, and you are told that some of these balls are red, while the remaining balls are either black or yellow, but you are given no information whatsoever about the precise distribution of black and yellow balls among those that are not red. You are then offered a choice between two different bets. In the first scenario, you can win a prize if you draw a red ball, and in the second scenario, you can win the same prize if you draw a black ball. Most people, when faced with this choice, prefer to bet on red because at least they know the odds, understanding that exactly 50 red balls exist in the urn. However, the paradox emerges when the scenario shifts slightly. Now you are offered a different pair of bets, one that pays if you draw either a red or yellow ball, and another that pays if you draw either a black or yellow ball. Suddenly, many of the same people who preferred the red bet in the first scenario now prefer the black or yellow combination in the second scenario, even though this preference directly contradicts the logical consistency of their original choice. This contradiction reveals a fundamental flaw in how human beings approach decision-making under uncertainty, a phenomenon that economist Daniel Ellsberg documented and demonstrated in 1961. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from what researchers call ambiguity aversion, which is the human tendency to prefer known risks over unknown risks, even when the unknown risk might objectively be superior or identical. Our minds seem to treat the uncertainty of not knowing the distribution of black and yellow balls as fundamentally more threatening than simple probability. And this psychological aversion to ambiguity causes us to systematically violate the axioms of rational choice theory that supposedly govern all logical decision-making. Imagine you are presented with a choice that reveals one of the deepest contradictions in how we understand risk and safety. You are told there exists a vial containing a substance that will cause you significant harm, perhaps illness or discomfort, and you are given two options. You can either consume a tiny measured dose of this toxin now, or you can wait and consume a much larger dose later. The paradox emerges not from the mathematics of the choice, but from the strange reasoning we employ when facing real-world scenarios involving hormesis and protective adaptation. The Toxin Puzzle asks us why we willingly expose ourselves to small amounts of poisons, stressors, and harmful agents in controlled contexts, vaccines containing inactivated pathogens, exercise that damages muscle tissue so it rebuilds stronger, alcohol in moderate amounts, intense heat exposure through saunas, or even the immune system's need to encounter minor threats. Yet we simultaneously treat any uncontrolled exposure to toxins as absolutely unacceptable. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in our inability to reconcile two competing frameworks: the threshold model, which suggests that small amounts of harm are safe and beneficial, and the precautionary principle, which insists that exposure to toxins should be minimized entirely. Our brains struggle to hold both truths simultaneously, creating a cognitive dissonance that we resolve through compartmentalization and selective reasoning rather than through logical consistency. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we do not even recognize it as a paradox anymore. We celebrate the person who runs marathons despite the immediate cellular damage. We vaccinate our children with substances we would never consume in their full form, and we recommend cold exposure therapy while simultaneously warning against exposure to harsh conditions. Imagine calling your cable provider to schedule an installation or repair, and they tell you they can arrive sometime between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, a window of 10 hours during which you must remain home and available, unable to leave for work, unable to run errands, unable to conduct the normal business of your life. And then the technician arrives at 5:59 in the afternoon, just as you've begun to assume they won't come at all. This is the cable guy paradox, and it persists across decades despite being fundamentally irrational and universally despised. The mechanism operates on several interconnected layers that together create an almost impenetrable system of scheduling dysfunction. First, there is the time window itself, which is so broad that it renders the appointment nearly meaningless from the customer's perspective, while simultaneously allowing the service provider to maintain scheduling flexibility that benefits only their operational efficiency, not the person whose life is being held in suspension. The cable company justifies this by claiming route unpredictability and the variable duration of service calls. Yet they possess the data and logistics systems to narrow these windows considerably if customer satisfaction were genuinely prioritized. Second, there exists a psychological phenomenon where the company's interests are perfectly aligned with keeping you uncertain, because certainty would require hiring additional staff, better training, more precise scheduling algorithms, or paying technicians bonuses for punctuality, all of which would cut into profit margins. By maintaining perpetual uncertainty, they have successfully externalized the cost of their inefficiency onto millions of consumers who lose productivity, paid time off, and peace of mind. Third, and perhaps most peculiarly, we have collectively normalized this experience to such an extent that we view a cable technician actually arriving within the scheduled window as a minor miracle worthy of grateful relief, rather than as the bare minimum standard of professional service that it should be. Imagine a researcher conducting a clinical trial to test whether a new medication is effective, and they gather data from 100 patients, finding results that would occur by random chance only 5% of the time if the drug truly had no effect, which by conventional standards constitutes statistical significance and leads to the publication of their findings and the adoption of the treatment in hospitals worldwide. Yet a Bayesian statistician examining the same evidence might conclude that the probability the drug actually works is disappointingly low, perhaps only 10 or 20%, because they consider what was plausible before seeing any data at all, and this fundamental disagreement between two mathematically rigorous approaches to the exact same question represents the essence of the Lindley Paradox, named after statistician Dennis Lindley, who articulated it in 1957. The paradox emerges from the collision between frequentist and Bayesian statistical philosophy, two languages for describing uncertainty that seem to speak past each other with increasing volume the more data accumulates, because a frequentist cares about how often their decision procedure would be wrong across repeated experiments, while a Bayesian incorporates prior beliefs and asks what the data reveals about what is actually true in this specific situation. And when sample sizes grow very large, a frequentist might declare something significant while a Bayesian remains unconvinced because the prior probability of the claim was extremely low to begin with. Imagine you are sitting across from someone you trust, and they say to you with complete sincerity, "It is raining outside, but I do not believe that it is raining." The statement seems grammatically coherent, and logically there is nothing self-contradictory about the words themselves, yet something feels profoundly wrong, almost absurd in a way that makes you question whether the person is being dishonest or perhaps experiencing a cognitive failure. This is Moore's paradox, named after the philosopher G. E. Moore, who first identified this peculiar feature of human expression and belief. The paradox occurs when someone asserts a proposition while simultaneously denying their own belief in it, or conversely, asserts their disbelief while claiming the proposition is true. What makes this paradox so unsettling is not that it is logically impossible, because technically one could believe the statement without believing themselves, yet the very utterance of such a sentence creates an overwhelming sense of contradiction that violates something deeper than mere logic. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the implicit performative contradiction embedded in speech itself. When you assert something in conversation, you are not merely stating a fact, you are simultaneously performing a commitment to believe that fact. To say, "It is raining," is to announce to your listener that you hold this belief, and therefore to immediately follow it with, "But I do not believe it is raining," is to deliberately undermine the very foundation of your assertion, creating a pragmatic incoherence that logic alone cannot capture. The paradox persists not because we have failed to solve it, but because we have come to understand that the contradiction lives in the act of speaking itself rather than in the content of the words. We continue to find this strange because our minds recognize that honest communication requires alignment between what we assert and what we claim to believe, and any violation of this alignment feels like a breach in the basic social contract that allows us to communicate at all. Consider the author who completes a manuscript and writes a preface acknowledging that the book contains errors, omissions, and imperfections that they themselves have noticed, but decided to publish anyway. And then that same author expects readers to trust the content within those pages as though it were reliable and worthy of their time and attention. The preface becomes a confession of unreliability wrapped inside a request for belief, a simultaneous admission of fallibility, and a plea for credibility that operates on two incompatible levels of discourse. This occurs regularly in academic works, memoirs, philosophical treatises, and self-help books where authors will openly declare that their research may be incomplete, their interpretations debatable, or their conclusions provisional, yet they present these works with enough confidence and formal structure to suggest they deserve serious consideration. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves a curious psychological compartmentalization wherein the author separates the act of creation from the act of presentation, as though writing a disclaimer somehow absolves them of responsibility for the claims they make, while simultaneously maintaining those claims deserve publication. The reader encountering this preface faces an impossible task. They must simultaneously maintain skepticism about specific unreliable elements while suspending that same skepticism enough to engage meaningfully with the argument. We have normalized this paradox to such an extent that it barely registers as contradictory anymore, treated as merely the honest acknowledgement of human limitation. Yet it remains fundamentally illogical that we would knowingly introduce potentially false information into circulation while requesting trust in the overall project. The preface becomes a strange social contract where both author and reader agree to pretend that partial unreliability is compatible with general reliability, that mistakes can be cordoned off through confession, and that the act of naming one's limitations somehow transforms those limitations into acceptable features rather than disqualifying flaws. Imagine a world in which a scientist sets out to prove a simple logical statement, "All ravens are black." To do this, she decides to examine every raven she can find, and if they are all black, then her hypothesis will be confirmed. This seems like a straightforward empirical approach to validation, the kind of reasoning we use constantly in everyday life, but here is where the paradox emerges with quiet insistence. According to the rules of formal logic, if the statement "all ravens are black" is true, then its logical contrapositive must also be true. Anything that is not black is not a raven. This means that every time the scientist observes something that is not black and is not a raven, a red apple, a green bottle, a yellow pencil, she has technically gathered evidence that supports her original claim about ravens being black. By this logic, examining 1,000 non-black non-ravens would be just as valid for confirming her hypothesis as examining 1,000 black ravens, which somehow feels deeply wrong despite being logically sound. The mechanism that creates this paradox lies in the gap between mathematical validity and intuitive reasoning. The rules of formal logic are indifferent to what feels meaningful to our minds. They care only about the structural truth of statements. When we examine a red apple, we are not gathering information about ravens in any practical sense, yet the logical system insists we are. The paradox persists because it reveals a fundamental tension between how we naturally acquire knowledge through direct observation and how pure logic operates in its abstract realm. We have come to accept this paradox not by resolving it, but by understanding that confirmation in logic and confirmation in practice operate on entirely different wavelengths. And yet we continue to trust both systems simultaneously without fully reconciling the contradiction. Imagine yourself standing in complete and utter darkness, a darkness so profound that you cannot see your own hand before your face. And in this moment of absolute visual deprivation, you experience a profound sense of dread and vulnerability that seems entirely disproportionate to any actual threat. This is the essence of what we might call the Grue Paradox, named after the invisible monster from the text-adventure game Zork, a creature that existed only in darkness and only in the player's imagination, yet somehow generated genuine fear despite being entirely fictional and completely invisible. The paradox lies in this remarkable phenomenon. We are terrified of what we cannot see in the dark, not because we have any logical reason to believe that danger lurks there, but because our minds conjure vivid threats from the blank canvas of darkness itself. In the real world, darkness provides no evolutionary advantage to predators that hunt humans, yet our limbic system responds as though ancient dangers still prowl in shadows, as though saber-toothed cats and hostile competitors might be mere inches away. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through the intersection of several psychological processes working in concert. The absence of visual information creates a vacuum that our pattern recognition systems desperately try to fill, leading us to imagine threats as a defensive strategy. Our brains, evolutionarily tuned to assume danger in uncertain situations, generate elaborate scenarios of potential harm when sensory input is limited, essentially treating the unknown as guilty until proven innocent. Furthermore, the darkness itself becomes a symbol of the unknowable, of loss of control, of vulnerability, and our imaginations weaponize this symbolic weight by projecting fears onto the emptiness. Imagine a machine so perfectly designed that it can simulate any experience you could possibly desire with absolute fidelity, creating neural states indistinguishable from reality itself, allowing you to live out your fantasies of accomplishment, romance, adventure, and meaning while your body remains in a tank of fluid, connected to electrodes that feed your consciousness an endless stream of convincing illusions, and the question posed to you is simple: would you plug in? Most people, when confronted with this thought experiment, recoil instinctively, claiming they would never abandon the real world for such a simulation, insisting that there is something fundamentally valuable about actually living rather than merely experiencing the sensation of living. Yet this immediate rejection reveals something peculiar about human psychology that deserves deeper examination. The mechanism underlying our resistance to the experience machine appears to involve our intuitive sense that reality itself carries intrinsic value beyond the mere subjective sensations it produces, that there is a meaningful difference between truly accomplishing something and experiencing the neural correlates of accomplishment while sitting passively in a vat. That knowing your relationships are genuine rather than programmed interactions changes their value in ways that transcend your subjective emotional states. We resist the machine because we seem to care not just about how life feels from the inside, but about what is actually true about our lives, about whether our achievements are real, whether our loved ones are actual people with their own consciousness and agency, whether we are genuinely changing the world or merely experiencing the illusion of doing so. Consider the person who structures their entire existence around the pursuit of pleasure, who wakes each morning with the singular ambition of maximizing enjoyment, comfort, and satisfaction in every waking moment. They seek out experiences they believe will bring happiness, luxurious meals, entertainment, leisure, the avoidance of discomfort at all costs. Yet as weeks and months pass, something peculiar emerges. The very activities that were meant to deliver pleasure begin to feel hollow, repetitive, and strangely unsatisfying. The once anticipated meal becomes routine. The entertainment grows stale. The avoided discomfort transforms into boredom and restlessness, a deeper dissatisfaction that no amount of additional pleasure-seeking can remedy. The hedonist discovers that by directly targeting happiness as the primary goal, they have somehow moved further away from it, as though happiness operates like a paradoxical prey that only reveals itself to those who are not hunting for it directly. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the way human psychology actually structures meaning and satisfaction. Pleasure derives much of its intensity not from the experience itself, but from contrast, anticipation, struggle, and the relief that follows difficulty. When pleasure becomes constant and unconditional, it loses its relational properties. The brain habituates rapidly to repeated stimuli, requiring ever-increasing doses to generate the same neural response. Furthermore, many of the activities that produce genuine long-term satisfaction involve an element of challenge, sacrifice, or delayed gratification, the opposite of hedonistic immediacy. Building relationships, developing skills, creating something meaningful, or contributing to others all involve friction and discomfort in service of something larger than momentary pleasure. The hedonist, by bypassing these processes in pursuit of direct satisfaction, ends up missing the deeper fulfillment that emerges from struggle and purpose. What remains remarkable is how persistently this paradox operates despite being logically available to understand. Consider the experience of watching a film or reading a novel in complete solitude, fully aware that every character, every dialogue, every moment of tension exists only as patterns of light on a screen or ink upon a page, yet finding yourself genuinely moved to tears, genuine fear, genuine joy by these non-existent entities and their non-existent struggles. You know with absolute certainty that Hamlet did not exist, that his indecision was never real, that his mother's betrayal happened in no actual castle in Denmark, and yet when he dies on stage, something within you grieves as though a real person has fallen. This is the paradox of fiction. We simultaneously hold two contradictory beliefs, knowing something is false while responding to it as though it were true, and we do this not out of confusion or delusion, but as a deliberate act of consciousness. The mechanism behind this peculiar human capacity lies in our brain's remarkable inability to fully distinguish between simulated experience and real experience at the emotional level. When you witness a character's suffering on screen, your mirror neurons activate as though you yourself are suffering alongside them. Your amygdala produces genuine stress responses. Your heart rate elevates in authentic fear, all triggered by events that never occurred and could never occur outside the fictional frame. We possess this extraordinary cognitive flexibility that allows us to willingly suspend disbelief, to temporarily bracket our knowledge of reality and treat the invented as genuine, creating what philosophers call a willing suspension of disbelief that requires no actual suspension at all because the emotional systems of our brains cannot tell the difference between fiction and reality once we have agreed to engage with the story. Imagine you are tasked with creating the optimal world and you face a choice between two populations. World A contains 1 billion people living extraordinary lives of profound happiness and meaning, each experiencing well-being at a level of 90 on a scale of 100. World B contains 10 billion people, all living lives worth living, but at a more modest level of 45 on that same scale, meaning their existence is positive and valuable, yet far less exuberant than those in World A. The paradox emerges through what philosophers call the mere addition principle, which suggests that if we can make additional people exist whose lives are worth living, and doing so does not make anyone's life worse, then this addition must be considered good and morally desirable. Yet when we apply this reasoning incrementally, adding billions of modestly happy people across numerous steps, we eventually arrive at a world of astronomical population where almost everyone experiences mere subsistence-level contentment, a conclusion that intuitively repels us even though each individual step seemed unarguably beneficial. The mechanism underlying this paradox lies in the conflict between two deeply held moral intuitions. The first being our utilitarian impulse that creating happy lives is inherently good, and that we should seek to maximize total well-being across all conscious beings, and the second being our conviction that there exists something uniquely valuable about quality of life, about the depth and richness of individual human experience, suggesting that a smaller population living magnificently somehow possesses greater value than a vast population merely surviving contentedly. Imagine three voters choosing between three candidates, alpha, beta, and gamma. The first voter prefers alpha over beta and beta over gamma. The second voter prefers beta over gamma and gamma over alpha. The third voter prefers gamma over alpha and alpha over beta. When we tally the results by comparing candidates head-to-head, we discover something deeply unsettling. Alpha defeats beta in a direct matchup with 2 votes to 1, beta defeats gamma with 2 votes to 1, and yet gamma defeats alpha with 2 votes to 1. We have arrived at a perfect circle of preference with no logical endpoint, no clear winner, and no rational way to determine the will of the group, despite the fact that each individual voter behaved with perfect internal consistency. This is the Condorcet Paradox, named after the 18th century French mathematician and philosopher Marie-Jeanne-Antoine-Nicolas de Caratat, Marquis de Condorcet, who first identified this troubling phenomenon in democratic systems. The mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from the fundamental incompatibility between individual rationality and collective rationality, a gap that grows wider as more voters and options enter the system. When preferences are intransitive at the group level, no voting method can perfectly capture the will of all participants simultaneously without violating at least one principle we consider essential to fairness. The paradox persists in modern democracies not because we fail to understand it, but because we have accepted the uncomfortable truth that collective decision-making carries inherent contradictions that no amount of procedural refinement can entirely eliminate, leaving us to manage these logical impossibilities through arbitrary rules and ranked choice methods rather than resolving them outright. Imagine a group of people trying to make a collective decision about something that matters to them, whether it is electing a leader, choosing a policy direction, or selecting a course of action that will affect everyone involved. And imagine further that each person in this group has their own rational preferences, their own ranking of what they believe is best, organized in a clear and logical order from most preferred to least preferred. Now imagine trying to combine all of these individual preferences into a single group preference, a social choice that represents what society as a whole wants, and here is where the impossibility begins to reveal itself. Economist Kenneth Arrow proved in 1950 that no voting system or preference aggregation method can satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable and desirable criteria simultaneously. Criteria such as unrestricted domain, where any individual preferences should be allowed non-dictatorship, where no single person's preferences should automatically become the group preference, Pareto efficiency, where if everyone prefers option A to option B, then the group should also prefer it to B. And independence of irrelevant alternatives, where the group's preference between two options should depend only on how individuals rank those two options relative to each other and not on how they rank other options. The theorem demonstrates that whenever you try to build a voting system that respects all these reasonable principles, you inevitably run into contradictions and paradoxes, situations where collective choices become circular or irrational even though all the individual inputs are perfectly rational. What makes this particularly unsettling is that we conduct elections and make group decisions constantly, operating under the illusion that we can aggregate diverse preferences into a coherent social choice. Yet mathematics proves this is fundamentally impossible, at least in the way we imagine it should work. Imagine listening to two musical notes played in sequence, one after the other, separated by an interval known as a tritone, which is exactly half an octave apart. And as you listen to this pair of tones, something peculiar happens in your auditory perception that defies the fundamental logic of how sound should behave. The Tritone Paradox, discovered by psychologist Diana Deutsch in the late 1970s, presents a situation where two tones that are played in ascending order can simultaneously be perceived by different listeners as descending, or by the same listener under different circumstances as moving in opposite directions, even though the physical sound itself never changes. When you hear a tritone pair, your brain must decide whether the sound is moving upward or downward in pitch. Yet because the tritone divides the octave perfectly in half, there exists an ambiguity in pitch perception that makes it genuinely impossible for your auditory system to determine with certainty which direction the sound is traveling. The mechanism that creates this paradox lies deep within how your brain processes pitch information and the organizational structure of how we perceive musical space. Your brain relies on something called the pitch chroma, which is the cyclical nature of musical notes, and the pitch height, which is the absolute frequency of the sound, and when these two dimensions conflict with each other, your subjective perception becomes unreliable. The tritone occupies a unique position in musical space, because moving up a tritone from any note lands you exactly halfway to the octave above, creating what is sometimes called the devil's interval because of its historical dissonance and its modern perceptual ambiguity. Different people, and sometimes the same person under different listening conditions or expectations, will hear the exact same recording as ascending when it is objectively ascending, or descending when it is objectively ascending, depending on which perceptual framework their brain chooses to apply. Imagine a musical tone that seems to ascend endlessly, climbing higher and higher without ever actually reaching a peak. A sound that perpetually rises, yet somehow remains exactly where it started, creating an auditory illusion so convincing that your brain accepts the impossible as inevitable. This is the Shepard tone, discovered by cognitive scientist Roger Shepard in 1964, and it represents one of the most elegant demonstrations of how our sensory perception can be fundamentally deceived by carefully constructed mathematical patterns. The tone is constructed by layering multiple sine waves, each separated by an octave, all of which increase in volume as they rise in pitch, while simultaneously decreasing in volume as they fall, creating a continuous loop that tricks the auditory cortex into perceiving an unending ascent that logically cannot exist. When you listen to a Shepard tone, you experience a genuine physiological response, a real sensation of rising pitch, even though you can intellectually understand that the sound must be returning to its starting frequency, because octaves are mathematically equivalent and the pattern is cyclical. The mechanism relies on the brain's tendency to follow the loudest frequency and to perceive pitch relationally rather than absolutely, meaning your auditory system naturally tracks the ascending component while your conscious mind ignores the descending frequencies that complete the circle. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling for sleep is that it creates a psychological tension between what you hear and what you know must be true, establishing a cognitive dissonance that keeps your mind engaged even when you desperately want rest. We listen to the Shepard tone and cannot help but anticipate a climax that never arrives, a resolution that the sound design explicitly prevents, leaving us in a perpetual state of expectation that our brains interpret as ascending tension despite the mathematical reality of its stasis. Imagine walking up a staircase, step after step, climbing higher and higher with each footfall, your legs growing weary from the endless ascent, only to discover after a full rotation that you have somehow returned to exactly where you began, having gained no elevation whatsoever, as though the architecture itself has conspired to make the impossible seem inevitable. This is the Penrose Stairs, a construction that was first conceived by the mathematician Roger Penrose and his father Lionel Penrose in 1958, a theoretical impossibility rendered as a paradoxical drawing that has since captivated the imagination of artists, architects, and philosophers alike. The stairs exist in a kind of spatial contradiction where each individual step appears geometrically sound and locally correct when viewed in isolation. Yet the structure as a whole violates the fundamental laws of three-dimensional space, creating an endless loop that defies the conservation of potential energy and the very nature of vertical displacement. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the deliberate manipulation of perspective and angle, where the artist or designer has carefully arranged the viewpoint in such a way that our eyes are forced to accept as true something that our mathematical intuition knows to be false, exploiting the fact that two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional space are inherently ambiguous and can encode information that the eye interprets one way while the mind suspects another. The stairs work because perspective projection allows for multiple valid three-dimensional interpretations of a single two-dimensional image, and our visual system, which evolved to navigate real spaces with consistent physics, simply chooses to believe the most straightforward interpretation even when that interpretation is fundamentally impossible. Consider a tavern on any given evening, filled with patrons seated at tables and standing at the bar, each nursing their drinks with varying degrees of enthusiasm and sobriety. Now imagine selecting one person at random from this crowd, any person will do, and applying a single logical proposition, Either this person is a drinker or they are not. If they are a drinker, then there exists at least one person in the tavern who, if they drink, means everyone drinks. Conversely, if they are not a drinker, then everyone in the tavern must be a drinker, because if even one person abstains from drinking, the logic collapses. This is the drinker paradox, a statement that seems to prove, through pure reason alone, that in any group of people there must exist at least one person such that if that person drinks, then everyone in the group drinks. The paradox arises from our natural resistance to this conclusion, because it appears to claim something absurd, that one person's drinking somehow forces everyone else to drink, as though their consumption of alcohol creates a magical compulsion that extends to all surrounding individuals. The mechanism that makes this paradox persist involves a fundamental misunderstanding of how logical implication actually functions in formal reasoning. The statement does not claim that one person's drinking causes everyone else to drink through physical or social mechanisms. Rather, it exploits the nature of conditional logic itself, where an implication is considered true whenever the antecedent is false or the consequent is true. When applied to groups with even a single non-drinker, the logic becomes technically valid, though deeply counterintuitive to our everyday understanding of cause and effect. Despite its logical validity, we resist accepting the conclusion because it violates our intuitions about how reality works. Yet the paradox persists in philosophical discussions precisely because it reveals the gap between formal logic and human reasoning, demonstrating that mathematical truth and intuitive truth are not always aligned. Imagine a container divided into two chambers by a wall, with a small door that only one intelligent being could operate. This being, known as Maxwell's demon, sits at this door and makes a seemingly simple decision. Whenever a fast-moving molecule approaches from the left chamber, the demon opens the door and lets it through to the right. Whenever a slow-moving molecule approaches from the right, it opens the door and allows it to pass leftward. Over time, this selective sorting would cause all the fast molecules to accumulate on one side and all the slow molecules on the other, creating a temperature difference between two identical chambers that were previously in equilibrium. This temperature difference could then theoretically be harvested to do useful work, which would appear to violate the second law of thermodynamics, the law that entropy, or disorder, always increases in a closed system. The paradox seems to suggest that intelligence and information could reverse the universe's tendency toward disorder without any energy cost whatsoever. The mechanism at work here involves a profound misunderstanding about what information actually costs. The demon must measure each molecule's speed before deciding whether to open the door, and this measurement, this gathering of information about the system's state, requires energy expenditure at the quantum level. Furthermore, the demon must store information about which molecules it has already evaluated, and storing information has a thermodynamic cost. The erasure of old information generates heat. Once these hidden energy requirements are properly accounted for, the apparent violation dissolves entirely. The second law remains unbroken. Yet Maxwell's demon persists in our collective imagination as a metaphor for intelligence outsmarting physical law, for information as a form of power that transcends material constraint. We continue to invoke it in conversations about artificial intelligence, about whether consciousness could somehow slip past entropy's grip, about whether sufficiently advanced knowledge could exempt us from the universe's fundamental rules. In 1935, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen published a paper that would haunt quantum mechanics for nearly a century, describing a scenario so troubling that it seemed to expose a fundamental flaw in our understanding of reality itself. Imagine two particles that become entangled, their quantum states forever linked in such a way that measuring one instantaneously affects the other, even if they are separated by vast distances across the universe with no possible communication between them. When you measure the spin of the first particle and find it pointing up, the second particle's spin becomes down, or vice versa, instantaneously collapsing from an undefined state into a definite one across the void of space. This phenomenon suggests that either reality does not exist in a definite state until observed, or information travels faster than light, both conclusions that seem to violate everything physics had established about causality and locality. The paradox emerges from the logical tension between our intuitive understanding of how the world should work and what quantum theory actually predicts. We assume that objects have definite properties independent of observation, a principle called realism, and that influences cannot propagate faster than light, a principle called locality. Yet quantum mechanics, verified countless times through experiment, insists that we must surrender at least one of these assumptions. For decades, physicists found themselves trapped between accepting the ghostly action at a distance that Einstein famously called spooky, or embracing the unsettling notion that reality itself is fundamentally indeterminate until consciousness or measurement collapses it into being. The peculiar persistence of this paradox lies in our inability to fully accept either resolution, for both seem to demand we relinquish something precious about our conception of reality. Imagine a watched pot that genuinely refuses to boil, not because of some metaphorical truth about patience, but because the universe itself seems to obey a strange law where observation freezes change into place. This is the quantum Zeno effect, named after the ancient Greek philosopher who pondered whether motion was even possible, and it describes a counterintuitive phenomenon where the act of repeatedly measuring a quantum system prevents it from transitioning into a different state, effectively halting its natural evolution through the sheer force of continuous observation. In the quantum realm, particles exist in superposition, meaning they exist in multiple potential states simultaneously until measured, at which point the wave function collapses and they settle into one definite state. But here is where it becomes genuinely unsettling. If you measure that particle continuously, over and over again in rapid succession, you force the collapse to happen repeatedly, and each collapse resets the system back to its initial state, preventing the particle from ever naturally decaying or transitioning to another configuration. The mechanism driving this paradox rests on the fundamental nature of quantum mechanics itself, where measurement is not passive observation but active intervention that fundamentally alters reality. Each measurement collapses the quantum state, and the time between measurements is what allows the system to evolve. By eliminating that temporal gap through relentless observation, you mathematically prevent that evolution from occurring. The particle cannot change because you are constantly forcing it to be what it already is, like trying to watch a flower bloom by photographing it every nanosecond and expecting the images to capture growth rather than stasis. What makes this paradox so persistently haunting is that it has actually been experimentally verified in laboratories, confirmed through careful measurements of atomic decay rates and quantum state transitions, yet it remains genuinely counterintuitive to our macroscopic experience where watching something does nothing to change its behavior. Imagine a ladder leaning against a wall at a particular angle, and you decide to measure the distance from the base of the ladder to the wall, then measure the height where the ladder touches the wall. You record these measurements and create a ratio, a relationship between horizontal distance and vertical height. Now imagine you tilt the ladder slightly closer to the wall, making the angle steeper. Intuitively, you expect the horizontal distance to decrease and the vertical height to increase. But here emerges the paradox. If you continue tilting the ladder toward vertical, at some point the ratio of horizontal to vertical distance reaches a minimum before it begins to increase again, yet your intuition tells you it should only move in one direction. The latter seems to violate the simple expectation that as one measurement decreases, the other should continue increasing indefinitely. This mathematical contradiction reveals something deeper about how our brains process spatial relationships and proportional change. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from the nonlinear nature of ratios themselves. When you work with the Pythagorean theorem and the constraint that the ladder's total length remains constant, the relationship between the base distance and the wall height becomes more complex than our surface-level reasoning can grasp. We expect linear relationships where they do not exist, assuming that pushing something in one direction will produce proportional results in another. We have become so accustomed to this assumption in everyday life that when mathematics reveals a point of inflection, a moment where our directional intuition inverts, we experience genuine cognitive dissonance. The paradox persists not because the mathematics is unclear, but because we continue to think about ladders using everyday heuristics rather than the actual geometric constraints governing them. We accept this peculiar behavior as merely interesting rather than truly paradoxical, having normalized the gap between our intuition and reality. Imagine two identical spaceships stationed at rest in empty space, separated by a fixed distance from one another, with a fragile string connecting them. Both ships receive identical acceleration profiles, accelerating together at the same rate in the same direction for the same duration, with perfect synchronization from the perspective of a stationary observer watching from a fixed frame of reference outside the system. According to classical mechanics, nothing should change between the ships. They maintain their separation, they accelerate uniformly, and the string should experience no additional stress whatsoever. Yet when we apply the principles of special relativity to this scenario, something counterintuitive emerges. The distance between the two spaceships actually increases from the perspective of observers riding aboard the accelerating vessels, even though they are accelerating at identical rates. This occurs because of the relativity of simultaneity and length contraction effects, which means that the string, being a physical object with finite tensile strength, experiences an increasing strain and will eventually break, despite the fact that no external force acts to pull the ships apart. The paradox lies in the disagreement between reference frames. The stationary observer sees no additional stress, while the accelerating observers see the distance between ships growing inexorably. This creates a profound conceptual tension that reveals something fundamental about the nature of space, time, and relative motion. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from the fact that acceleration in relativistic spacetime is not as straightforward as our intuitions suggest. Maintaining a constant proper distance between two accelerating objects requires unequal coordinate acceleration, yet here we have equal coordinate acceleration, creating a growing proper distance. Imagine standing at the edge of a black hole, watching matter and light spiral into an infinite darkness from which nothing ever returns, and yet physicists tell us that somehow, impossibly, the information contained within that doomed matter must still exist somewhere in the universe, encoded perhaps in the subtle radiation that the black hole itself emits as it slowly evaporates over trillions of years. This is the information paradox, one of the most unsettling contradictions in theoretical physics, where two of our most fundamental laws of nature appear to be in direct and irreconcilable conflict. The paradox emerges from a collision between quantum mechanics, which insists that information can never be truly destroyed, only transformed and scattered, and general relativity, which describes black holes as regions where all information that crosses the event horizon is obliterated forever, lost beyond any possible observation or recovery. When Stephen Hawking discovered in 1974 that black holes emit radiation and eventually evaporate completely, the problem intensified because if a black hole could disappear entirely, taking all its information with it, then the universe would be violating the sacred principle of quantum mechanics that demands information conservation. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so difficult to grasp is that we have no intuitive framework for understanding what happens to information when it falls past a point of no return, and our minds struggle to reconcile the permanence we expect from physical laws with the apparent annihilation implied by event horizons. For decades, physicists simply lived with this contradiction, treating it as a problem for future generations to solve, accepting that the two pillars of modern physics might both be true and yet fundamentally incompatible. And this uneasy coexistence has become normalized in the scientific community almost as if contradiction itself were a feature rather than a bug of our deepest understanding of reality. Consider the modern digital firewall, that invisible barrier designed to protect our computers and networks from unauthorized access and malicious threats by filtering incoming and outgoing traffic according to predetermined security rules. The firewall stands as our guardian, monitoring every packet of data that attempts to cross its threshold, allowing safe passage to legitimate requests while blocking anything deemed suspicious or dangerous based on its rule set. Yet here exists a profound paradox that undermines the very foundation of this protective philosophy. The firewall itself must exist somewhere, must run on some hardware, must process data through some system, and that system must itself be protected from the threats it is supposedly designed to prevent. This creates an infinite regress of protection requiring protection, a bootstrapping problem that cannot be solved through the logic that created it. The firewall becomes both the lock and the locksmith, both the barrier and the potential vulnerability, and we accept this logical impossibility as routine infrastructure without meaningful hesitation. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how we have constructed elaborate social and technical systems to obscure its existence. We speak of firewalls as if they are separate from the systems they protect, but they are not separate at all. They are intrinsically part of the same digital ecosystem, subject to the same vulnerabilities, the same potential compromises, the same fundamental uncertainties about what truly constitutes a threat. We layer firewall upon firewall, creating nested systems of protection, each one assuming that something below it remains trustworthy and uncorrupted, yet we cannot verify this assumption from within the system itself. The paradox persists because we have normalized the concept so thoroughly that questioning its logical coherence feels almost naive, as though pointing out that our guardian requires guarding is somehow missing the pragmatic point. Imagine you are traveling toward a bridge that spans a treacherous river, and standing at its entrance is a figure who presents you with an ultimatum. You may cross only if your next statement is true, but if your statement is false, you will be cast into the waters below. This is the paradox of Buridan's bridge, a logical puzzle that extends the classical liar's paradox into a narrative framework of impossible choice and suspended consequence. The scenario forces you to construct a statement that cannot be evaluated as either true or false without creating an internal contradiction, effectively paralyzing the bridge keeper's ability to enforce the rule. If you declare something like, "Either my statement is false, or you will not throw me into the river," you create a logical knot that cannot be untangled by the stated conditions, leaving the keeper unable to determine whether you have satisfied the entry requirement or violated it. The paradox reveals something profound about how rules and language interact at their boundaries, where the very mechanism designed to enforce a principle becomes disabled by the principle itself. What makes this paradox psychologically unsettling is not merely its logical structure, but the way it mirrors real-world situations, where we find ourselves caught between competing systems of authority or obligation that cannot simultaneously be satisfied. We navigate versions of Buridan's bridge constantly in our lives, whether facing bureaucratic requirements that contradict each other, social expectations that pull in opposite directions, or ethical dilemmas where every choice violates some principle we hold. Yet we manage these situations not through logical resolution, but through a kind of pragmatic acceptance. By acknowledging that perfect consistency is impossible and proceeding anyway, and perhaps the real insight is that we have always been crossing bridges we cannot logically justify crossing. Consider the statement, "I know that I know nothing." At first glance, this appears to be a humble acknowledgement of ignorance, perhaps even wisdom in the tradition of Socrates, but when you examine it closely, a peculiar logical entanglement emerges that defies resolution. If you truly know nothing, then you cannot know that you know nothing, because knowing that you know nothing is itself a piece of knowledge, which contradicts the initial claim. Yet if you do know something, specifically that you know nothing, then the statement becomes false, because you have demonstrated knowledge. The paradox traps itself in a recursive loop, where the act of knowing about your ignorance simultaneously creates knowledge and denies it, leaving you suspended in a state of logical vertigo. The mechanism underlying this puzzle operates through what we might call self-reference inflation, where a statement about the extent of one's knowledge becomes necessarily true and false depending on which direction you analyze it. When you attempt to step outside the paradox to examine it objectively, you only deepen your entanglement within it, because any claim about what you know or do not know automatically becomes subject to the same paradoxical machinery. Most of us navigate around this paradox in our daily lives without ever stopping to fully confront it, accepting instead a comfortable middle ground where we claim to know many things while acknowledging that vast territories of human experience and understanding remain unmapped and inaccessible to us. We have normalized this cognitive dissonance so thoroughly that it barely registers as strange anymore, yet the paradox persists at the foundation of human knowledge itself, quietly suggesting that perhaps the very framework we use to distinguish between knowing and not knowing might be fundamentally flawed or incomplete, a realization that offers no comfort and no escape. Consider the phrase, "the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words," and notice immediately how this description itself contains only 19 words, which means the number being described has just been described in fewer than 20 words, creating a direct logical contradiction that seems to collapse under its own weight. Barry Paradox, named after the librarian Griffith C. Barry, who first formalized this problem in the early 20th century, emerges from the deceptively simple observation that numbers can be described using language in various ways, and that some descriptions are shorter than others. Yet when we attempt to identify the boundary between describable and indescribable numbers through a finite word limit, we inadvertently create a self-referential trap that language itself cannot escape. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests fundamentally on the assumption that we can meaningfully divide all numbers into two categories: those that can be uniquely specified using fewer than a certain number of words, and those that cannot. Yet the moment we define a threshold and attempt to identify the first number in the latter category, our very act of identification provides a description that violates the rule we have set. This creates an oscillating logical impossibility where the definition of the indescribable number simultaneously describes it and undescribes it, leaving us suspended in a state of semantic vertigo that seems to have no resolution. What makes the Barber Paradox so philosophically unsettling is that it reveals something profound about the nature of language itself and our assumption that words operate in a purely mechanical way, free from the complications of self-reference and context. Yet in reality, language is fundamentally slippery and reflexive, capable of creating contradictions that do not exist in mathematical or formal systems. Consider the set of all numbers that can be defined in English using fewer than 100 characters, and imagine attempting to count how many such numbers exist in total. Richard's paradox emerges from this innocent inquiry when we perform a seemingly simple operation. We can define a new number as the smallest positive integer that cannot be defined in English using fewer than 100 characters. And when we write out this definition itself, we have just defined that number in English using far fewer than 100 characters, which means it should belong to the set we excluded it from. The paradox operates on the tension between what we can describe linguistically and what actually exists as a definable mathematical object, suggesting that language possesses a self-referential quality that allows it to violate its own constraints. At its core, this paradox reveals that the boundary between what can and cannot be expressed in language is far more permeable than we intuitively believe, because the act of describing an undefinable thing becomes itself a definition of that thing, creating a logical contradiction that undermines our confidence in how language maps onto mathematical reality. What makes Richard's paradox particularly unsettling is that it does not rely on any obscure or exotic mathematical concepts, nor does it depend on technical notation or symbolic manipulation. Instead, it operates entirely within the domain of ordinary English prose and common sense, suggesting that language itself contains hidden depths of self-reference that remain largely unexamined in our everyday communication. We have normalized this paradox not by solving it, but rather by accepting the verdict that certain informal linguistic definitions cannot be formalized rigorously, and therefore we have constructed a boundary between the informal and the formal, declaring that only statements in precise mathematical language can be trusted to define numbers without paradox, effectively quarantining ordinary language as unreliable for such purposes, while simultaneously remaining dependent upon language to communicate mathematical truth itself. Consider the simple act of describing words themselves, for language possesses the peculiar ability to turn inward and make itself the subject of its own examination, which is precisely where the Grelling-Nelson paradox takes root in the fertile ground between meaning and self-reference. The paradox emerges when we categorize adjectives into two distinct groups, those that describe themselves, which linguists call autological words, and those that do not describe themselves, which are called heterological words. Take the word short as an example, for it is indeed a short word, making it autological, while the word long is itself a short word and therefore heterological, unable to embody the very quality it represents. This seems straightforward enough until we ask the critical question that unravels everything. Is the word heterological itself heterological or autological? If heterological is heterological, then it describes itself as not describing itself, which would make it autological, but if it is autological, then it must describe itself accurately, meaning it must be heterological, creating an infinite loop that logic cannot resolve. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the strange loop of self-reference, where language attempts to use itself as both the tool of description and the object being described simultaneously, a duality that our rational minds struggle to accommodate because most of our linguistic and logical systems assume a clear separation between observer and observed. We have normalized this paradox by simply avoiding it, by treating it as a curious intellectual oddity rather than a fundamental problem with how we structure meaning itself. And in doing so, we have allowed language to continue operating despite harboring this logical impossibility at its core, much like a computer program that functions perfectly while containing within it the seeds of its own contradiction. Consider the peculiar situation that emerges when you find yourself at a restaurant, hungry and eager to order a meal, only to discover that the menu contains dozens of curry options, each one promising to be different from the last. Yet when you finally receive your food, it tastes remarkably similar to every other curry you have ever consumed at every other establishment. The curry paradox describes this strange disconnect between the elaborate promise of infinite variation and the actual experience of profound sameness, a phenomenon that persists across cuisines, restaurants, price points, and continents with remarkable consistency. You walk into a Thai restaurant and see red curry, green curry, yellow curry, massaman curry, Panang curry, and at least 5 others on the menu, each with its own backstory and ingredient list that seems to justify its existence as a distinct dish. Yet they all somehow taste like they emerged from the same base recipe with minor adjustments to spice levels and protein choices. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a combination of factors that work together to create this persistent illusion of choice, where little genuine differentiation exists. First, there is the power of naming and presentation, whereby giving something a distinct cultural name or origin story causes our brains to expect it to taste different, even when the fundamental construction remains nearly identical, relying on the same foundations of coconut milk, curry paste, and slowly simmered proteins. Second, there is the role of confirmation bias, in which we convince ourselves that we are experiencing difference because we have already been primed to expect it, leading us to attribute any subtle variation in heat level or ingredient prominence to genuine distinction rather than random batch variation or our own changing palate. Consider a chain of infinitely many sentences, each one making a claim about all the sentences that come after it in the sequence. The first sentence states that all sentences from number 2 onward are false. The second sentence declares that all sentences from number 3 onward are false. The third sentence asserts that all sentences from number 4 onward are false, and this pattern continues indefinitely into infinity, never terminating. At first glance, this appears to be merely a self-reference problem, similar to the classical liar's paradox where a statement claims its own falsity, but something remarkable and deeply unsettling emerges when you actually examine the logical structure carefully. Unlike the liar's paradox, which involves a single statement referring to itself, Jablow's paradox involves no direct self-reference whatsoever, yet it still produces an impossible logical contradiction that cannot be resolved. If the first sentence is true, then all subsequent sentences must be false, which means the second sentence is false, but that would mean there exists at least one true sentence after it, contradicting the first sentence's claim. Conversely, if the first sentence is false, then at least one sentence from number 2 onward must be true, but this leads to an infinite regress where you can never actually locate which sentence, if any, could possibly be true. The mechanism at work here involves what philosophers call an infinite descent argument, where the logical consequences of any assumption about truth values ripple infinitely forward, creating a perpetual contradiction that cannot be escaped through any assignment of truth or falsehood to any member of the sequence. What makes Jablow's paradox particularly fascinating and intellectually disturbing is that it achieves genuine paradox without requiring any sentence to reference itself directly, which means it cannot be dismissed as merely a quirk of self-referential statements. Consider the infinite set of all positive integers stretching endlessly into mathematical abstraction, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on without bound or terminus. Now consider only the perfect squares within this same infinite landscape, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, and continuing infinitely as well. By every intuitive measure of quantity and size, we would expect there to be fewer perfect squares than total integers, since the squares are merely a subset, a portion carved from the larger whole. Yet when Galileo examined this problem in the 17th century, he discovered something that defied common sense entirely. For every single positive integer, there exists a corresponding perfect square. The integer 1 matches to 1 squared, the integer 2 matches to 4, the integer 3 matches to 9, and this correspondence continues perfectly and infinitely without exception or remainder. This means that despite perfect squares being visibly rarer as numbers grow larger, they are nonetheless infinite in exactly the same quantity as the integers themselves, suggesting that one infinite set can be genuinely equal in size to another infinite set that properly contains it. The mind resists this conclusion with remarkable force because our intuition about sets and quantities developed in a world of finite collections, where a subset must always be smaller than its whole. We struggle to accept that the part and the whole can possess equal cardinality because our everyday experience tells us this should be impossible. Yet mathematics reveals it to be not merely possible, but inevitable, when dealing with infinite sets. Rather than dismiss this as mere mathematical trickery, we have come to understand through centuries of mathematical development that infinity operates by rules fundamentally alien to our finite existence, and we have normalized this profound strangeness by incorporating it into the foundations of modern mathematics. We accept without hesitation what Galileo first discovered with bewilderment, treating the counterintuitive as routine. Imagine a hotel with infinitely many rooms, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, stretching endlessly into existence with no final room, no last corridor, no ultimate end to its architecture. David Hilbert, a mathematician of the early 20th century, constructed this thought experiment to help us understand the strange and counterintuitive properties of infinity, particularly how infinity behaves in ways that finite quantities never could. One evening, this infinite hotel is completely full, every single room occupied, every guest settled in for the night, yet a new traveler arrives at the front desk seeking accommodation. The manager, faced with this impossible situation in any finite hotel, simply smiles and announces a solution. He will ask the guest in room 1 to move to room 2, the guest in room 2 to move to room 3, the guest in room 3 to move to room 4, and so on throughout the entire infinite expanse of the hotel. In this cascading relocation, every existing guest moves to the next numbered room, and miraculously, room 1 becomes available for the newly arrived traveler. But the paradox deepens when infinitely many new guests arrive all at once, a countably infinite crowd of people with no rooms to their names. The manager is unfazed. He asks every guest in an odd-numbered room to move to double their room number, so the guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 3 moves to room 6, room 5 goes to room 10, and this doubling pattern continues infinitely. In doing so, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and since there are infinitely many odd numbers, infinitely many guests can be accommodated. This peculiar mathematics emerges because infinity plus 1 equals infinity, and infinity times 2 also equals infinity. We encounter echoes of Hilbert's hotel in our contemporary world whenever we grapple with concepts of unlimited digital storage, endless streaming content, or the seemingly boundless expansion of the internet itself. Consider a shape that exists only in mathematical space, a three-dimensional object so peculiar that it possesses infinite surface area yet encloses only finite volume, a contradiction so profound that it seems to violate the fundamental laws of geometry itself. This is Gabriel's horn, named after the archangel Gabriel who in Christian tradition announces the end of days, a fitting attribution given that this mathematical construct announces the end of our intuitive understanding of space. The horn is constructed by taking the graph of the function 1 divided by x, starting from x equals 1 and extending infinitely outward to the right, then rotating this curve around the x-axis to create a three-dimensional solid of revolution. The result is a shape that begins with a finite radius at its opening and gradually tapers to an infinitely thin point as it extends forever into the distance, becoming narrower and narrower without ever quite reaching zero width. The paradox emerges when mathematicians calculate the properties of this form, discovering that while the volume contained within this horn is finite, approximately equal to pi, the surface area covering the outside of this horn is infinite, a mathematical impossibility that should not exist in any coherent geometric system. This means you could theoretically fill Gabriel's horn with a finite amount of paint, yet you could never paint its surface because you would require an infinite amount of paint to cover an infinite surface area. The psychological mechanism behind why this paradox unsettles us so deeply relates to our fundamental intuition about physical objects and mathematical consistency. We have learned through lived experience that objects in 3 dimensions follow predictable rules. Larger things contain more volume, expansive surfaces require more material to cover, and infinity in one property seems to demand infinity in others. Gabriel's horn violates this intuitive expectation so completely that even mathematicians initially resisted its validity, yet the proof is absolute and irrefutable. Imagine a lamp that can be switched on and off instantaneously, and imagine that you begin a peculiar ritual. You turn it on for 1 minute, then off for half a minute, then on for a quarter of a minute, then off for an eighth of a minute, and you continue this pattern infinitely, with each interval becoming progressively smaller, approaching but never quite reaching zero. This is Thomson's lamp, a thought experiment devised by philosopher James F. Thomson in 1954 to explore the logical impossibilities that emerge when we attempt to complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time. After exactly 2 minutes have elapsed, you will have performed an infinite sequence of actions, toggling the switch an infinite number of times, and yet here lies the paradox. There is no final state. You cannot determine whether the lamp is ultimately on or off, because there is no last action in the sequence to establish its final condition. The lamp has been switched infinitely many times, yet the infinite series converges to a definite endpoint in time, a mathematical certainty, and yet the logical outcome remains fundamentally undetermined. The mechanism that makes this paradox so intellectually unsettling is the collision between our intuition about causality and completion, which demands that any process that ends must have a final state, and the mathematical reality of infinite convergent series, which can be completed in finite time while containing no final element. We experience this tension because we are accustomed to thinking about actions and their consequences in discrete, countable ways, where each action has a determinate result, yet infinity refuses to cooperate with this framework. What makes Thomson's lamp particularly persistent in philosophical discourse is that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about what it means for something to be done or finished. And it persists because we have not adequately resolved whether the rules of logic or the rules of mathematics should govern our understanding of physical processes. Imagine an infinite hotel with infinitely many rooms, each one occupied by a guest, and imagine that at noon on a given day, an unusual procedure begins that will continue forever. The manager removes guests from rooms 1 through 10, places them temporarily in a holding area, and then returns guests from the infinite queue outside into rooms 1 through 9, leaving room 10 empty. At 1 minute past noon, the manager repeats this process, removes guests from rooms 11 through 20, returns guests from the queue to rooms 11 through 19, and leaves room 20 empty. At 2 minutes past noon, the same procedure happens with rooms 21 through 30, and this process continues indefinitely, hour after hour, day after day. Each time the procedure occurs, 9 new guests are added to the hotel and 10 are removed, meaning that with each iteration, the number of occupied rooms decreases by exactly 1. After infinite iterations, you might reasonably expect that the hotel would be completely empty, yet paradoxically, infinitely many guests remain. This is the Ross-Littlewood paradox, a counterintuitive result discovered by Sheldon Ross and Derek Littlewood that reveals how our intuitions about infinity systematically mislead us when we attempt to apply finite logic to infinite processes. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon the surprising behavior of infinite sets and the way that infinity can behave differently depending on how you approach it. When dealing with finite quantities, removing more items than you add always results in fewer items overall. However, in the realm of infinite sets, this common-sense principle breaks down entirely because infinity possesses multiple layers and densities. The hotel rooms that are left empty form a sequence that extends infinitely. Room 10, room 20, room 30, and so forth. Yet because there are infinitely many rooms to begin with, having infinitely many empty rooms still leaves infinitely many occupied rooms remaining. Consider the simple act of pointing at something red and saying the word red. We assume we have defined what red is, that we have captured its essence in a single word, and that everyone who hears this word understands the same thing. Yet Alfred Tarski, a Polish logician working in the 20th century, discovered something profoundly unsettling. Truth itself cannot be defined within the very language system that produces true statements. In other words, there exists no way to construct a definition of truth using only the words and logical rules of English or any other language that would allow us to say with absolute precision what makes a statement true. The moment we attempt to define truth, we find ourselves standing outside the system, looking in, unable to complete the task from within. We can describe truths. We can say that snow is white because snow is actually white. But we cannot define what it means for any statement to be true without invoking concepts that themselves require definition, leading us into an infinite regress or a circular reasoning that devours its own tail. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this paradox stems from our deep-seated assumption that language is sufficient to contain all knowledge about itself, that meaning can be fully captured by arrangement of words alone. We construct elaborate philosophical systems believing that somewhere, nestled in the right combination of terms and logical operations, lies the complete definition of truth. Yet this confidence rests on a category error. Truth is not a property of language, but a relationship between language and reality, and no purely linguistic system can account for something that transcends language itself. We persistently normalize this impossibility by simply refusing to think about it, by accepting the circular reasoning that we use language to define concepts within language and calling this sufficient. Consider the following peculiar situation. Mathematics has constructed an entire formal system to describe the infinite, complete with proofs that certain infinities exist and cannot be reduced to smaller infinities. Yet when we examine this system through the lens of model theory, we discover something deeply unsettling, that there exists a model of set theory in which all of these infinities, including those proven to be uncountably infinite, are actually countable, meaning they could theoretically be listed in a sequence like the natural numbers themselves. This is Skolom's paradox, named after the logician Thoralf Skolem who identified it in the early 20th century, and it represents one of the most philosophically troubling contradictions in mathematical logic, not because it is logically inconsistent, but because it reveals something profoundly strange about how we discuss infinity and what we actually mean when we use the language of mathematics. The mechanism behind this peculiarity emerges from a careful examination of the relationship between syntax and semantics, between what our formal statements claim and what actually exists in various interpretations of those statements. When we prove that uncountable sets exist within our formal system, we are making a statement that is true within standard mathematics. Yet a countable model of that same formal system can exist where, from within that model's perspective, those sets appear uncountable relative to that model's own definition of countability, while simultaneously being countable from the outside perspective of a broader mathematical universe. This is not a logical contradiction because countability and uncountability are not absolute properties, but rather relational ones, dependent upon which mathematical universe we inhabit and what tools for counting are available within that universe. Imagine standing before the largest possible collection of all ordinal numbers, those mathematical entities that represent the order and sequence of infinite sets, and imagine that this collection itself must possess an ordinal number greater than any ordinal number contained within it, which would mean this collection is not actually the largest collection of ordinal numbers at all, creating an infinite regression that undermines the very foundation of what we thought we understood about mathematical hierarchy and order. The Borel-Kolmogorov Paradox emerges from this peculiar logical contradiction discovered by the mathematician Cesare Borel-Kolmogorov in 1897, a paradox that reveals a fundamental tension within set theory and the way we attempt to structure infinity itself into neat, comprehensible categories. At its core, the mechanism works like this. We assume that ordinal numbers form a well-ordered set, meaning they can be arranged in a sequence where every element has a position, and that this collection of all ordinals must itself have an ordinal number, a position in the hierarchy of order, yet this position would necessarily be greater than every ordinal number it contains, which contradicts the very definition of a complete collection of all ordinals. The paradox exposes how our intuitive reasoning about collections and totality breaks down when we try to apply it to infinite mathematical structures, revealing that certain collections cannot exist as coherent wholes without generating logical contradictions, much like trying to create a map so detailed that it must contain itself as a territory within its own boundaries. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that it demonstrates we cannot simply assume that every logically describable collection forms a valid set, that the rules of mathematics which work perfectly for finite and countably infinite structures suddenly fail when we reach certain thresholds of abstraction, and that our attempts to find the ultimate foundation of mathematics may be chasing something fundamentally incoherent. Imagine you are a mathematician in the late 1800s and you have just convinced yourself that you understand infinity. Georg Cantor has given you a framework, a hierarchy of infinities where some infinities are larger than others, where the infinity of real numbers is genuinely bigger than the infinity of whole numbers, and you have accepted this strange but internally consistent truth. Then Cantor asks you to consider the set of all sets, the ultimate collection that contains everything that can possibly be collected, and he shows you something that should not be able to exist. If you take the set of all sets and apply his own mathematical logic to it, you discover that there must exist a set even larger than the set of all sets, which is logically impossible because the set of all sets is supposed to be the largest possible collection by definition. You have arrived at a contradiction that emerges not from carelessness, but from the very foundation of set theory itself, a foundation that Cantor built. The mechanism at work here is that any well-defined set has a power set, a set of all possible subsets within it, and this power set is always provably larger than the original set, always bigger, always greater in cardinality. But when you apply this rule to the set of all sets, the container that is supposed to contain absolutely everything, you find that its power set must exist somewhere and must be larger, yet there is nowhere for it to exist because there is no space outside of everything. Imagine a library with a very specific cataloging system where a master catalog exists to list all the catalogs in the library that do not list themselves. And this master catalog must decide whether it should list itself within its own pages, creating an immediate logical trap from which no escape exists. This is the essence of Russell's paradox, named after the British philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell, who discovered it in 1900, and won while examining the foundations of set theory, that mathematical framework we rely upon to organize and understand all abstract collections of objects. The paradox emerges from a deceptively simple question. If we create a set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members, does that set contain itself? And if it does, then by definition it should not, yet if it does not contain itself, then by definition it must. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep human assumption that language and logic can always describe reality without contradiction, that every meaningful statement must have a definite answer, and that self-reference is merely another tool we can deploy safely like any other mathematical operation. We have grown so accustomed to treating sets as fundamental building blocks that we rarely question whether the very concept of self-membership makes coherent sense. Yet Russell's discovery revealed a chasm at the foundation of mathematical thought itself. Despite the paradox having been identified for over a century and mathematicians having developed various formal systems to work around it, such as type theory and axiomatic set theory with restricted membership rules, we continue to write mathematics as though the underlying logic is perfectly transparent and unproblematic, normalizing a resolution that merely prevents the paradox from arising rather than explaining why it seemed natural to begin with. Consider the infinite in its most abstract form. Mathematicians have long asked whether there exists a set of numbers whose size falls strictly between the size of the natural numbers and the size of the real numbers. And the answer to this seemingly straightforward question has haunted mathematical philosophy for over a century without resolution. Georg Cantor, the mathematician who developed set theory and gave us the tools to measure infinity itself, proposed that no such intermediate infinity exists, that the jump from countable infinity to uncountable infinity has no steps in between, and this proposition became known as the continuum hypothesis. The paradox is not merely that we cannot prove it true or false using the standard axioms of mathematics, but rather that we have proven we fundamentally cannot prove it, that it exists in a peculiar mathematical realm where it is independent of the very foundations upon which all mathematical reasoning rests. What makes this truly mind-bending is that we have constructed entire valid mathematical systems where the continuum hypothesis is true and entirely separate valid systems where it is false, both logically coherent and internally consistent, suggesting that truth itself might be a property that depends on which mathematical universe you happen to inhabit. The psychological mechanism behind our acceptance of this paradox lies in our ability to compartmentalize. We simply acknowledge that some questions exist beyond our current reach and continue building mathematics anyway, treating the continuum hypothesis as something akin to a philosophical shadow that lurks at the periphery of mathematical consciousness without demanding resolution. In 1931, a mathematician named Kurt Gödel published a proof that fundamentally shattered the dream of absolute mathematical certainty, demonstrating that any consistent formal system complex enough to describe basic arithmetic will necessarily contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system itself. Imagine constructing an elaborate set of rules and axioms designed to capture all mathematical truth, a perfect logical foundation upon which all knowledge could rest, and then discovering that your system, no matter how carefully constructed, will always contain statements that are true but forever unprovable by its own rules. This is not a limitation of human intelligence or computational power, but rather an intrinsic property of sufficiently complex formal systems. A mathematical law as immutable as gravity. The mechanism operates through a process of self-reference, where a statement essentially claims its own unprovability within the system, creating a logical paradox that reveals the system's inherent incompleteness. When mathematicians attempted to prove all statements within their axiomatic systems, they encountered this invisible boundary, a horizon beyond which no amount of logical rigor could venture. What makes this paradox so profound is that we have largely normalized the incompleteness of knowledge without fully acknowledging what this means for our pursuit of truth itself. Science continues to search for unified theories and complete explanations. Philosophy still aspires toward systems of absolute understanding, and we construct increasingly complex frameworks for knowledge, all while living under a mathematical proof that says such completeness is fundamentally impossible. We have accepted this conclusion intellectually, yet continue to behave as though a final answer remains just beyond the next discovery, just within the next theorem, persisting in the very pursuit that Gödel showed must forever contain unprovable truths. Imagine you are a computer programmer tasked with an impossible assignment. You must write a program that can examine any other program, analyze its code, and definitively tell you whether that program will eventually finish running or whether it will loop forever without ever stopping. This is the essence of the halting problem, and it represents one of the most profound impossibilities in mathematics and computer science, a limitation so fundamental that it cannot be overcome no matter how clever or powerful your technology becomes. The halting problem was formally proven unsolvable by Alan Turing in 1936, and the proof works through a devilishly elegant logical trap that reveals why no such universal solution could ever exist. The mechanism behind this impossibility operates through self-reference and contradiction, much like the ancient liar's paradox where a statement claims its own falsehood. If you could create a program that determines whether other programs halt, you could then feed that program's own code into itself, asking it to analyze its own behavior, which creates an immediate logical contradiction where the program would need to produce an answer about itself that directly contradicts what that answer claims. This is not merely a matter of insufficient computing power or algorithmic cleverness. The barrier is theoretical and absolute, woven into the very structure of logic itself. What makes the halting problem particularly mind-bending, as we contemplate it late at night, is that we have fundamentally normalized the existence of this impossibility within our computational systems, accepting that there will always be tasks we assign to our machines that cannot be solved through any conceivable method. And we have built our entire digital civilization knowing full well that this fundamental unpredictability will always lurk beneath the surface. Consider a solid sphere, a perfectly ordinary ball that you might hold in your hand, and imagine that you possess the theoretical ability to decompose it into a finite number of non-overlapping pieces, not by cutting it with any instrument, but by separating it into abstract mathematical subsets that exist in three-dimensional space. Now imagine that you can reassemble these exact same pieces, using only rigid motions and rotations, no stretching or deforming, and suddenly you have created not one sphere but two spheres, each identical in size and shape to the original, despite the fact that you have added no material and removed nothing, as though the universe itself has permitted you to violate the conservation of volume through pure geometry. This is the Banach-Tarski Paradox, proven rigorously in 1924 by mathematicians Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, and it stands as perhaps the most unsettling theorem ever formally established within the domain of mathematics, because it appears to demonstrate that solid matter can be duplicated through purely logical means. The mechanism underlying this impossibility lies in the strange properties of infinite sets and the rotating symmetries of three-dimensional space, specifically that in dimensions higher than 2, certain infinite point sets can be rearranged in ways that defy all intuition about volume and measure, and the pieces involved are so fragmented and geometrically complex that they possess no well-defined volume in any conventional sense.